They thought they were inheriting a quirky treehouse in the woods, a cozy little escape for their retirement years. But when this elderly couple discovered a hidden room, sealed behind hand-carved walls, what they found inside wasn't just valuable. It was $215 million in forgotten fortune that powerful people had killed to protect, and now someone wanted it back. Before you explore, we dive into the story. Make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The first snow of November fell soft and silent over the mountain town of Pine Ridge, Colorado. A place so small it didn't appear on most maps, and most people liked it that way. The kind of town where everybody knew your name, your business, and probably your grandmother's maiden name too. Where the general store still had a wooden floor that creaked, and the post office closed at noon on Saturdays because Betty Turner needed to get to her grandson's basketball games. Margaret Walsh stood at her kitchen window, watching flakes drift past the yellow glow of the porch light, each one catching the light like a tiny star before melting into the darkness. At 73, her hands moved slower than they once did, the joints swollen with arthritis that came from decades of gardening, canning, and the simple, repetitive work of a life well lived. But those hands still knew how to knead bread until the dough sang beneath her palms, still knew how to button Howard's shirt collar when his fingers fumbled in the morning, still knew how to hold his calloused palm across a worn dining table in a grip that said more than words ever could. Howard sat in his recliner nearby, the old leather one that had molded itself to his body over 20 years of use. Reading glasses perched on his nose, flipping through the newspaper with the kind of patience only decades of marriage could teach a man. At 75, he was thinner than he used to be, his shoulders not quite as broad, his hair reduced to a silver fringe around his ears. But his eyes were still sharp, still the same blue that had caught Margaret's attention at a church social 54 years ago. And his hands, though marked with age spots and old scars from his years working construction, were still steady enough to hold a coffee cup without spilling and strong enough to change a tire when their old Suburban needed it. They'd lived in this modest ranch house on Elm Street for 42 years, raised 3 children within these walls, their heights still marked in pencil on the kitchen doorframe. Sarah, Jessica, and Michael, all grown now with children of their own, scattered across Colorado and Wyoming, living their own lives, but calling every Sunday without fail. Margaret and Howard had buried both sets of parents from this house, had weathered illnesses and financial struggles, had celebrated anniversaries and grieved miscarriages, had lived the kind of quiet, unremarkable life that most people dream about in their golden years. Their days followed a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. Howard rose at 6, made coffee in the same percolator they'd received as a wedding gift, brought Margaret a cup in bed, even though his knees protested the stairs. They ate breakfast together, oatmeal mostly, with brown sugar and cinnamon. Howard read the paper while Margaret worked on crossword puzzles, both of them comfortable in the silence that comes when you've said everything that needs saying and learned to appreciate the quiet. Mornings were for errands, the grocery store, the pharmacy, the occasional doctor's appointment that seemed to multiply with each passing year. Afternoons found Howard in his workshop, a converted garage where he built birdhouses and small furniture pieces that he donated to the church bazaar. Margaret tended her garden in the warmer months, and in winter she quilted, her fingers moving across fabric with the same patient precision she'd brought to raising children and managing a household on a construction worker's modest income. Their life was simple, predictable, safe. The kind of life that doesn't make for interesting dinner party stories, but makes for peaceful sleep and genuine contentment. They had enough money to pay their bills, enough health to enjoy their grandchildren, enough love to fill the quiet spaces between words. They expected to live out their days exactly like this, until the very end, however and whenever that came. They'd even picked out their burial plots, side by side at Pine Ridge Cemetery, beneath a cottonwood tree that turned gold every autumn. But everything changed the day the letter arrived. It came on a Tuesday, the third week of October, when the aspens had turned to flame on the mountainsides, and the morning air carried that particular sharpness that promised winter wasn't far behind. Margaret had been sorting through the mail at the kitchen counter. The usual assortment of bills, grocery store circulars, and a postcard from their daughter Sarah, who was vacationing in Arizona. But then her hand stilled on a thick cream envelope, the kind that suggested importance, with an attorney's return address embossed in the corner. Caldwell, Pembroke and Associates, Denver, Colorado. Howard, she said quietly, her voice carrying that particular tone he'd learned over 54 years of marriage meant something significant had just happened. What is it? He set down his coffee cup and moved to her side, one hand resting on the small of her back, the way he always did when she needed steadying. Margaret opened it at the kitchen counter while Howard poured coffee. The envelope, releasing that particular scent of expensive paper and legal importance. Inside was a letter, typed on heavy stock, and it began with words that made her breath catch somewhere between her lungs and her throat. Dear Mrs. Margaret Walsh, we are writing to inform you of an inheritance left to you by your late uncle, Edmund Hartley. Margaret's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. Her hand trembled slightly, making the surface of the coffee ripple like a tiny lake disturbed by wind. Howard, she said again, this time barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, reading over her shoulder, his breath warm against her ear. The letter continued in that formal, measured language attorneys use when delivering news that will fundamentally alter someone's life. Edmund Hartley. The name stirred memories that Margaret had filed away decades ago, dusty and half forgotten. He'd been her mother's brother, the youngest of 5 siblings, and the odd one, the one the family whispered about at reunions but never directly discussed. The one who'd left Kansas for Colorado in his 20s and mostly disappeared from family gatherings after that. Margaret had met him exactly twice in her entire life. Once at a family reunion when she was 11, a gangly girl in a hand-me-down dress, and Uncle Edmund had seemed impossibly tall and impossibly strange, with wire-rimmed glasses and a way of looking past people rather than at them, as if he could see things others couldn't. He'd given her a silver dollar and told her to spend it on something that would last. She'd bought a book about birds that she still had somewhere in a box in the attic. The second time was at her mother's funeral. 32 years ago. Edmund had stood apart from the family, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in the small Kansas church, and he'd approached Margaret after the service with that same distant expression. "Your mother was the best of us," he'd said, his voice rough with something that might have been grief or might have been guilt. Then he'd pressed an envelope into her hand, containing $500, and left without staying for the reception. She'd sent him a thank you card. He'd never responded. And that was the last time Margaret had thought about Edmund Hartley with any real attention. Until now. The letter explained that Edmund had passed away at the age of 97 in a care facility in Denver. He'd been living alone for decades before his health had declined enough to require assisted living. And even then, he'd been described by the staff as intensely private, declining visitors, keeping to himself, speaking to almost no one about his past. In his will, carefully prepared and legally airtight, he had left Margaret something. Not money, not stocks, not bonds. A property. Mr. Hartley owned a residential property located in the San Juan National Forest, approximately 50 miles southwest of your current residence, the letter read. This property includes a primary structure, approximately 2,000 square feet, along with 12 acres of surrounding land. As per Mr. Stace, Hartley's last will and testament, full ownership of this property, including all structures and contents therein, is hereby transferred to you as his sole surviving blood relative. Howard whistled low, a sound he made when something surprised him or concerned him, or both. A property? In the National Forest? Margaret kept reading, her eyes scanning the formal language that somehow managed to convey information while revealing almost nothing. The property had been maintained through a trust for decades, the letter explained, with funds Edmund had set aside specifically for that purpose. A caretaker had been employed, visiting monthly to ensure the structure remained sound. The pipes didn't freeze, the roof didn't leak. But now that Edmund had passed, the trust had dissolved, and the property legally belonged to Margaret. There were coordinates, precise to 6 decimal places. There was a rough map, hand-drawn, showing how to access the property from the nearest Forest Service road. There was a notation about limited access during winter months, and a warning about the isolation of the location. And at the bottom of the letter, in a different typeface, as if added as an afterthought, one line that made Margaret's skin prickle. The structure is unique. We recommend viewing the property in person before making any decisions regarding its disposition. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Howard's soft snores beside her, the sound as familiar as her own heartbeat. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting shadows that seemed to move and shift like living things. A property. Her uncle Edmund, a man she barely knew, a man who'd been a ghost in her family's history, had left her something. But why? Why her? He'd had siblings, other nieces, and nephews. She thought about that silver dollar, about his instruction to spend it on something that would last. She thought about the $500 at her mother's funeral, pressed into her hand like a secret. She thought about the way he'd looked at her, really looked at her, with eyes that seemed to see past the surface, to something deeper. Had he known even then that he'd leave her something? Had he been measuring her somehow, deciding if she was worthy? The questions circled in her mind like birds searching for a place to land. Finally, around 3 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and went downstairs. She made chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table with the letter spread in front of her, reading it again by the light of the old Tiffany lamp Howard had restored for their 30th anniversary. Couldn't sleep either. Howard's voice came from the doorway, making her jump slightly. He wore his old flannel robe and his hair stuck up in tufts that would have been comical if his expression wasn't so serious. "I keep thinking about him," Margaret admitted. "About Uncle Edmund. Why would he leave me anything? I barely knew him." Howard poured himself a glass of water and sat across from her, his gnarled hands wrapping around the glass the way a child holds something precious. Maybe that's exactly why. Maybe he didn't have anyone else who knew him either. The thought sat heavy between them. A man who'd lived 97 years, who'd built or bought a property in the mountains, who'd set up a trust to maintain it for decades, dying essentially alone with no one to leave his life's work to except a niece he'd met twice. It was one of the saddest things Margaret had ever contemplated. "We should go see it," Howard said finally. Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to say it was too far, too much trouble, that they should just sell it, sight unseen, and be done with it. But something in her chest, something that felt like curiosity mixed with obligation mixed with something she couldn't quite name, made her nod instead. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's go see what Uncle Edmund left behind. Let's go see what Uncle Edmund left behind." 3 weeks later, on a morning when the weather forecast promised clear skies despite the November chill, Margaret and Howard loaded themselves into their old Suburban and began the drive. Margaret had packed sandwiches, thermoses of coffee, blankets in case they got stuck, and a sense of trepidation she couldn't quite shake. The coordinates led them southwest, away from Pine Ridge's modest collection of streets and into wilderness that seemed to swallow civilization whole. They followed Highway 149, through mountain passes, where the road clung to cliffsides and the drop-offs made Margaret's stomach clench. Howard drove with both hands on the wheel, his jaw set in that expression of concentration she'd seen 1,000 times. They passed through towns even smaller than Pine Ridge, places that consisted of a gas station and maybe a bar and not much else. The aspens had mostly lost their leaves now, leaving silver-white trunks standing like ghost forests against the dark green of the pines. Snow clung to the highest peaks, and the air coming through the truck's vents tasted of ice and pine sap. 2 hours into the drive, they turned onto a Forest Service road. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt, then to something that was barely more than 2 tire tracks cutting through underbrush. The Suburban bounced and groaned, its suspension complaining about every rock and rut. "You sure this is right?" Howard asked, glancing at the hand-drawn map Margaret held. She checked the GPS on her phone, which was struggling to maintain a signal. "According to this, we're close, maybe another mile." The forest pressed in on both sides now, pine branches scraping against the truck's paint, the canopy so thick overhead that the sunlight filtered through in scattered beams that looked almost solid. They climbed higher, the engine working hard, the altitude making both of them slightly breathless. And then the trees opened up. They emerged into a clearing, and Howard stopped the truck so abruptly that Margaret braced herself against the dashboard. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Neither of them could. Before them stood something that shouldn't exist. Something that looked like it had grown from the forest itself, rather than being built by human hands. A structure that was part architecture, part sculpture, part dream, made solid. It rose 3 stories high, woven among ancient pines and Douglas firs whose trunks had to be centuries old. The building didn't fight the trees, it embraced them. Massive trunks passed through the structure itself, visible through walls of glass, supporting platforms and levels that spiraled upward like a wooden nautilus. The exterior was all natural wood, cedar, and pine weathered to silver gray, with curved beams that followed organic lines rather than straight angles. Enormous windows reflected the forest like mirrors, making it hard to tell where the building ended and the wilderness began. A stone chimney rose from the center, constructed from river rock in shades of gray and rust and cream, climbing past the highest level to release a thin curl of smoke into the cold air. Which meant someone had been here recently, or was here now. Stairs spiraled around the base of the largest tree, a pine so massive that 3 people couldn't have linked hands around it. The stairs were built from wood planks that had been carved and fitted with such precision that no nails were visible, just smooth, flowing lines leading upward to a deck that wrapped around the second level like a wooden embrace. "My God," Margaret whispered, her voice small and awed in the silence. Howard just shook his head slowly, his eyes moving over the structure with the appreciation of someone who'd spent his life in construction and recognized true craftsmanship when he saw it. "That's not a cabin," he said finally. "That's not even a house. That's art." They climbed out of the truck, their boots sinking into snow that was maybe 3 inches deep, fresh from last night's dusting. The air was so quiet they could hear individual snowflakes landing on their jackets, could hear the distant call of a raven, could hear their own hearts beating in their chests. The temperature had to be in the low 30s, cold enough that their breath fogged, but not so cold that it was unbearable. The sun, struggling through high clouds, cast everything in that particular winter light that made colors both muted and somehow more vivid at the same time. Margaret pulled the key from her coat pocket. The attorney had sent it with a second letter, this one containing more practical information, the caretaker's final report, information about the well and septic system, instructions for the generator. But Margaret had barely read any of it. She'd been too focused on the key itself, heavy brass, old-fashioned, worn smooth in places from decades of use. They approached the spiral stairs, and Margaret ran her hand along the railing. The wood was smooth as glass, maintained and cared for, and didn't even tremble when Howard tested his weight on the first step. They climbed slowly, Margaret first and Howard behind, both of them stopping occasionally to look out at the view that expanded with each level they ascended. From up here, they could see for miles. The forest spread out in every direction, a sea of green broken by the white of snow and the silver of aspen trunks. In the distance, mountain peaks rose against the sky, their summits lost in clouds. No roads were visible, no other buildings, no power lines or cell towers. Nothing but wilderness, pristine and ancient, and utterly silent, except for the wind moving through the pines. At the top of the stairs, the deck stretched wide, maybe 20 feet across, with benches built into the railing, and a small table carved from a cross-section of tree trunk. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Every detail had been considered, from the way water would drain through small gaps between the deck boards, to the angle of the benches that perfectly framed the view. The front door stood before them, and Margaret paused to really look at it. It had been carved from a single piece of oak. She was sure of it, thick and heavy, and covered in an intricate relief carving. Trees, mountains, rivers, a whole landscape flowing across the wood in 3 dimensions. She could see tiny animals hidden in the details, a bear among the trees, an elk at a stream, birds in flight. Someone had spent months, maybe years, carving this door. Her hand trembled as she fitted the key into the lock. It slid in smoothly, as if the mechanism had been oiled recently. She turned it and heard the solid click of the bolt drawing back. The door swung open on silent hinges, and warmth rushed out to greet them. Inside, the main room took Margaret's breath away for the second time in as many minutes. It was cozy, impossibly so, despite being larger than her entire living room back home. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, the same river rock as the exterior chimney, and within it, a fire crackled gently, orange flames dancing across split logs. The heat it threw was immediate and welcoming. Leather furniture was arranged around thick wool rugs in patterns of deep red and cream. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves, and those shelves were stuffed with hardcover books, their spines showing every color imaginable. A rolling ladder on a brass rail allowed access to the higher shelves, and Margaret immediately wanted to climb it to see what treasures might be hidden up there. The ceiling was high and vaulted, supported by exposed beams that had been left natural. their bark still visible in places. More tree trunks passed through the space, incorporated into the design like pillars in a temple. Everything was wood, warm tones of honey and amber and deep walnut, polished to a soft glow that seemed to come from within. The kitchen area occupied one corner, and it was like stepping back in time. No modern appliances, just a beautiful old cast-iron stove that looked like it belonged in a museum. Copper pots hanging from hooks on a wooden rack, open shelving displaying dishes that were clearly handmade, ceramic, each one slightly unique. A farmhouse sink sat beneath a window that framed a view of the forest, and the countertops were thick butcher block that had been oiled until they gleamed. The whole space smelled like pine sap and old paper and wood smoke and something else, something faintly spicy like cinnamon or clove, like someone had been baking recently. "Someone's been here," Howard said, moving toward the fireplace. He knelt and examined the logs. "This fire was started this morning, maybe a few hours ago." Margaret nodded, her eyes still moving over the room, taking in details. Photographs hung in simple wooden frames on the walls, black and white images of the forest in different seasons. The same views she could see from the windows, but captured in all their seasonal variations. Spring flowers, summer storms, autumn gold, winter silence. She moved closer to examine them and realized they weren't just nature photography. In some of them, barely visible, were two people, a man and a woman, young, working together to build something. In one photo, they were raising a beam, both straining with effort, their faces split with matching grins. In another, they sat on what would become the deck, tools scattered around them, the woman leaning against the man's shoulder while he pointed at something beyond the camera's frame. Margaret's throat tightened. Edmund and someone else. The woman he'd built this place with. A narrow staircase led to the second floor, its steps worn smooth in the center, from years of feet climbing up and down. Margaret climbed it slowly, one hand trailing along the wall, and found herself in a hallway with two bedrooms branching off. The first was small but perfectly formed, with a bed covered in a quilt that looked handmade, the stitching tiny and precise. The pattern was called wedding ring. Margaret recognized it, concentric circles interlocking in complex ways. A wedding ring. She touched it gently, feeling the layers of fabric and batting beneath her fingers. The second bedroom was even smaller, more of a guest room, with a single bed and a bookshelf and a window seat that overlooked the forest. She could imagine sitting there for hours, reading, watching the world outside. The third floor was a single open loft, its ceiling following the peak of the roof. A desk sat beneath a skylight, the surface neat and empty, except for a reading lamp and a leather-bound journal. Bookshelves lined every available wall space up here too, and Margaret realized her uncle had been a serious reader. Maybe books had been his companions in his self-imposed isolation. Back downstairs, Howard had found the bathroom, and he called out to her, "Margaret, you need to see this." She joined him and had to suppress a laugh. The bathroom was tiny but exquisite, with a clawfoot tub that had been positioned to face a window overlooking a small meadow. The fixtures were all vintage brass, and there was even a small wood-burning stove in the corner to keep the space warm. "Running water," Howard said, turning on the tap. Clear water flowed out, strong and clean. Fed by a spring, according to the report. Gravity-fed system. Brilliant engineering. They explored further and found a pantry stocked with canned goods. The dates on the labels showing they'd been purchased within the last 6 months. There was a shed outside containing a generator, well maintained and full of fuel. There was a woodshed with logs stacked neat and dry, enough to last through several winters. Everything worked. Everything had been cared for with obvious devotion. But something felt off, and it took Margaret a while to identify what it was. The space was too perfect, too carefully maintained for a place that had supposedly sat empty, except for monthly visits from a caretaker. This felt lived in, loved, tended, with daily attention. That evening, as the sun began to set and long shadows stretched across the clearing, Margaret found herself drawn back to the fireplace. She'd been standing there for several minutes, just looking at the flames, when her hand brushed against the mantelpiece. Her fingers caught on something. A seam in the wood, so fine she almost missed it. She stopped, leaned closer, examining the paneling that formed the wall beside the fireplace. At first glance, it looked like all the other wood in the room, carefully fitted planks creating a smooth surface. But this section was different. Subtly but definitely different. The grain pattern didn't quite match the surrounding wood. The color was a shade darker, as if it had been stained at a different time or with a different mixture. She pressed gently against it. Nothing happened. She tried sliding it left, then right. Still nothing. "Howard," she called softly. "Come. Look at this." He joined her, setting down the book he'd been examining. She pointed to the seam, and he ran his own hands over it, his experienced fingers finding details she'd missed. "There's something here," he confirmed. "The wood is different. And listen." He tapped his knuckles against the paneling. The sound was hollow, echoing slightly, like knocking on a door rather than a solid wall. They searched methodically, running their hands along every inch of the suspicious section. Margaret worked high while Howard worked low, both of them looking for a catch, a button, a trigger, anything that might reveal what lay behind. It was Howard who found it. Near the floor, hidden in the shadow cast by the stone hearth, a small indentation in the wood, barely larger than a thumbprint, and nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. He pressed it. A soft click echoed through the room, mechanical and final. The panel shifted inward an inch, breaking the seamless surface of the wall. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Howard looked up at her, his eyes wide, and she saw her own mixture of excitement and trepidation reflected there. Slowly, carefully, Howard gripped the edge of the panel and pulled. It swung open like a door, revealing darkness beyond, and releasing a breath of cold air that carried the scent of earth and stone, and something metallic, like old coins or dried blood. They stared into the black opening, neither moving, barely breathing. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called, and the sound seemed to come from another world, distant and strange. Margaret found her voice first. "Should we look?" Howard disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a flashlight he'd seen in one of the drawers. He clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing a narrow passage leading back into the wall, deeper into the structure, or maybe into the tree itself. "Stay close," he said, his voice carrying that protective tone he'd used when their children were small, and he'd checked for monsters in closets to prove they weren't real. Except this time, Margaret thought, they might actually find something. Howard entered first, his shoulders nearly brushing both sides of the narrow corridor. The walls here weren't finished wood but rough-hewn timber, and the ceiling was low enough that he had to duck slightly. The passage was short, maybe 15 feet, and it ended at another door. This door was nothing like the beautiful carved oak of the entrance. This was steel, modern, utilitarian, completely out of place in the rustic treehouse. It had a keypad lock, the kind you'd find on a safe or a secure facility, with 9 buttons glowing a dull red in the darkness. The contrast was jarring, intentional. Edmund had hidden something here, something important enough to seal behind both hidden panels and electronic security. Howard shone the flashlight around the small space at the end of the corridor. There was nothing else, no other way forward, no instructions, no clues, just the keypad and its softly glowing buttons. Waiting. Margaret stared at it, her mind racing. What would Edmund have used as a code? His birthday? But she didn't know his birthday. Some significant date from his life? But she knew almost nothing about his life. She thought about the 2 times she'd met him. The silver dollar and the instruction to buy something that would last. The money at her mother's funeral. The way he'd looked at her both times. Really looked at her. Like he was measuring something, deciding something. Then it hit her. Her mother's funeral, September 14th, 1991. The last time she'd seen Edmund alive. The last time they'd had any contact. With trembling fingers, she reached out and pressed 91491. Nothing happened. The light stayed red. She tried it differently. The month, the day, the year. 091419991. Too many digits. The keypad only had space for 6. She thought harder. September 14th, 9:14. Her mother's funeral. Maybe just the month and day? She tried again. 09114. Still nothing. Margaret, Howard said gently. His hand on her shoulder. Margaret said, his hand on her shoulder. But she wasn't ready to give up. She thought about the date again, turning it over in her mind. September 14th, 1991. What numbers mattered? What would Edmund have chosen? And then, almost without conscious thought, her fingers moved. She pressed 140991. The day, the month, the last 2 digits of the year, formatted the European way. The way someone who'd spent time in Switzerland, managing secret accounts, might format a date. Click. The red light turned green. The steel door hissed, a sound of pressurized air releasing, and swung inward on smooth hinges that had been maintained with the same care as everything else in this strange, hidden place. Margaret and Howard stood frozen at the threshold, the flashlight beam cutting through darkness that seemed thicker than normal darkness. Heavier, more substantial. Howard's hand found Margaret's, his calloused palm, warm and solid and real. They looked at each other in the dim glow of the green light. And Margaret saw every year of their marriage reflected in his eyes, every shared joy and sorrow, every moment of trust built and maintained. Together? He asked softly. Together, she confirmed. They stepped through the door into Edmund's secret, and their lives changed forever. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, carved directly into the massive trunk of the tree the treehouse had been built around. Margaret could see the growth rings in the exposed wood, centuries of life contained in those curving lines. The floor was concrete, cold, and practical. The ceiling had been reinforced with steel beams, and the walls, where they weren't ancient wood, had been lined with climate control panels that hummed softly, maintaining precise temperature and humidity. This wasn't just a hidden room. It was a vault, engineered with the same care and precision as a bank's safe deposit room. But what filled the vault made both of them freeze, their brains struggling to process what their eyes were seeing. Metal shelving lined every wall, floor to ceiling, industrial and sturdy. On those shelves sat wooden boxes, leather cases, and locked metal containers, dozens of them, all carefully labeled and organized with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime managing other people's money. In the center of the small room stood a wooden table, its surface covered with document tubes and a large, leather-bound ledger. Next to it was a leather portfolio with a brass clasp. Howard moved forward first, his hands shaking as he reached for the nearest leather case. It was the size of a briefcase, made from expensive hide that had been conditioned until it was supple as cloth. He unlatched it and lifted the lid. Inside, cushioned in dark velvet, were stacks of paper, not regular paper. These were certificates, elaborate and official, with ornate borders and seals embossed in wax and gold leaf. Bearer bonds. Margaret had seen them once before, years ago, when Howard's father had passed away, and they'd found some war bonds in his safe deposit box. But those had been small, $50 or $100 each. Souvenirs from the 1940s. These were different. She leaned closer, her reading glasses sliding down her nose as she read the denomination printed in elegant script across the top of the first certificate. $50,000. She counted the bonds in the case quickly. 10 of them. $500,000. Right there in her hands, in a single case. And there were dozens more cases on the shelves. "Howard," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He'd moved to another shelf and opened a different container. This one held gold certificates, the kind the government had issued before 1933, when private gold ownership had been restricted. Each certificate represented actual gold, stored somewhere, theoretically redeemable for the precious metal. These were worth $100,000 each. There were at least 20 in the container, box after box, case after case. Margaret and Howard moved through the vault like people in a dream, opening containers with trembling hands, finding things that shouldn't exist, that couldn't exist, that were absolutely, undeniably real. Stock certificates from IBM, dated 1962, before the splits, before the decades of growth that had made early investors millionaires. More from Coca-Cola, AT&T, General Electric, all from the 50s and 60s, when the prices had been pennies compared to what they'd become. Foreign bonds, Swiss and German and French, with account numbers and bank codes and official stamps. Real estate deeds to properties in Manhattan and San Francisco and Los Angeles, purchased decades ago when land in those cities could still be bought for reasonable prices, now worth fortunes. Gold coins in sealed tubes, South African Krugerrands and American eagles and Canadian maple leafs, their yellow gleam visible through the clear plastic. Hundreds of them, and in the back corner, in a fireproof safe that stood open, bundles of cash, old bills, mostly hundreds, wrapped in paper bands and stacked neat and precise. Not as impressive as the bonds and certificates, maybe $20,000 or $30,000, but present nonetheless, as if Edmund had wanted to ensure whoever found this place would have immediate access to liquid funds. Margaret's legs gave out. She sank onto the single chair in the room, her breath coming in short gasps that might have been panic, or might have been the thin air at this altitude, or might have been the sheer, overwhelming impossibility of what surrounded them. Howard stood with his back to her, his hand resting on one of the shelves, his shoulders shaking in a way that told her he was struggling with the same flood of emotion. Finally, after what might have been minutes or might have been hours, Margaret reached for the leather-bound ledger on the central table. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely open it. Inside, the handwriting was neat and precise. The kind that belonged to someone who'd spent their entire adult life working with numbers. Someone for whom accuracy wasn't just important, but essential. Column after column, row after row, listing assets, dates acquired, values, locations. Bearer bonds, Section AC. Estimated current value $9,200,000. Gold certificates, Section DF. Estimated current value $12,400,000. Stock certificates. Various. Section GM. Estimated current value $143,700,000. The list went on and on, each entry more staggering than the last. Margaret's eyes blurred with tears as she flipped through the pages, seeing Edmund's careful notation, his precise tracking of every single item in this impossible hoard. At the bottom of the final page, in handwriting that was shakier, less controlled, as if written recently by hands that had grown old and unsteady, a single line had been added. Total estimated value, as of December 2023, $215,400,000. The ledger slipped from Margaret's fingers and hit the concrete floor with a thud that echoed in the small space like a gunshot. $215 million. $215 million. Hidden in a tree, in the middle of nowhere, maintained for decades, preserved with the same care someone might give to a beloved family heirloom, left to her. To Margaret Walsh, a woman who'd lived her entire life on a modest income, who still clipped coupons and bought day-old bread and wore the same winter coat she'd owned for 15 years, because there was no reason to replace something that still worked. Howard turned around, and she saw her own shock mirrored on his face. His skin had gone pale, his eyes were too wide, and his hands trembled as he gripped the shelf behind him for support. "Margaret," he whispered, "what the hell did your uncle do?" She shook her head, unable to form words. The room seemed to be spinning, or maybe she was spinning, or maybe the whole world had tilted on its axis, and nothing would ever be level again. That's when she noticed something else. On the shelf nearest the door, separate from the organized cases and containers, sat a small wooden box. Simple, unadorned, just smooth wood, with a brass latch. With numb fingers, she stood and reached for it. The box was light, almost empty. She carried it back to the chair and opened it with hands that no longer felt like her own. Inside were two things: a photograph and a letter. The photograph showed a younger Edmund, maybe in his early 40s, standing beside a beautiful woman with dark hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes that seemed to laugh even in the still image. They had their arms around each other, comfortable and close, and they stood in front of what was clearly this very treehouse, though it was only partially built, the frame visible, the vision still taking shape. They looked happy. No, more than that. They looked complete, like two pieces of something that had finally found each other and made sense together. Margaret turned the photo over. Written on the back in faded blue ink, "Sarah and me, 1976. The year we built our dream. Sarah." Edmund had loved someone named Sarah, and together they'd built this impossible place. The letter was folded in thirds, the paper yellowed with age, the creases deep from being opened and closed many times over many years. Margaret unfolded it carefully, and even before she began reading, she knew this was important. This was the answer to all the questions they hadn't yet learned to ask. The handwriting was Edmund's. She recognized it from the ledger. But this was more personal, less controlled. the writing of someone unburdening their soul rather than recording transactions. If you're reading this, it began, then I'm gone, and you've found what I spent my life protecting. I need you to understand, this money isn't mine. It never was. I took it. Margaret's hands tightened on the paper, crinkling the edges. Not all at once, not in some grand heist like you see in movies, but over years, decades, small pieces, at a time from people who wouldn't notice, people who had so much they'd never miss it. I told myself I was evening the scales, that the rich owed something to the world they'd built their fortunes on. I told myself I was going to use it for good, to help people, to make a difference. But the truth is simpler and more shameful. I was a thief. A careful, patient, clever thief. But a thief nonetheless. I diverted funds, created false accounts, moved money through offshore holdings and shell corporations. I worked for banks and investment firms that managed wealth for people who'd earned their fortunes through exploitation and tax evasion. And I convinced myself that made it okay. That stealing from thieves wasn't really stealing. I built this place with Sarah, the only woman I ever loved, the only person who ever truly knew me. We planned to disappear here, to live out our days in peace, to maybe do something good with all this wealth I'd accumulated. But she died before we could. Cancer took her in 1977, just a year after we finished building. And I've been alone ever since, living with what I'd done, unable to spend the money because it felt cursed, unable to return it because I'd covered my tracks too well. If you've found this, Margaret, it's because you're the only family I had left who might understand. Your mother, my sister, she was the best of us, the most honest, the most kind. When she looked at me, I could see disappointment, but also compassion. I think she knew, somehow, what I'd become. I'm leaving this to you not as a gift, but as a burden. Do with it what you will, but know that it comes with ghosts. Every dollar in this vault represents a choice I made, a line I crossed, a piece of my soul I sold for the belief that I was smarter than the rules everyone else had to follow. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even ask for understanding. I just hope that maybe, somehow, something good can come from all this wrong. Edmund Hartley, October 2023. The letter ended there, no signature beyond his typed name. As if, even at the end, he couldn't quite commit to fully owning what he'd done. Margaret read it twice, then handed it to Howard, who read it while she sat in silence, trying to process everything. Her uncle had been a thief. Everything in this vault, every bond and certificate and gold coin, had been stolen, carefully, methodically, over decades, but stolen nonetheless. And now it belonged to her, legally, technically, according to the laws of inheritance and the will that had been properly executed and filed. But morally? Ethically? What did it mean to inherit a fortune built on crime, even if that crime had been committed against people who were themselves criminals, or at least morally compromised? Howard finished reading and set the letter down carefully. He looked at Margaret, his face grave, and she saw that he was thinking the same things she was. This wasn't a windfall. It was a test. Maybe it was Edmund's final test, to see what kind of person his niece had become, what choices she would make when faced with wealth that shouldn't exist. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe Edmund had just been a lonely, guilty old man who'd run out of time to fix his own mistakes and was hoping someone else might do it for him. The fire in the main room had burned down to embers by the time they emerged from the vault. They'd closed everything carefully, sealed the steel door, pushed the wooden panel back into place. But Margaret knew they could never unsee what they'd found, could never unhear Edmund's confession. They stood in the darkness of the cozy treehouse, surrounded by books and comfortable furniture, and the ghost of a love story that had ended too soon, and faced the biggest decision of their lives. "We need to leave," Howard said finally, his voice rough. "Right now, we need to go home and think about this." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. They locked the beautiful carved door behind them, descended the spiral stairs in darkness, and drove back down the mountain in complete silence. Neither of them slept that night. They sat at their kitchen table in Pine Ridge, the same table where they'd opened the lawyer's letter, and stared at each other as the weight of $215 million in stolen money pressed down on them like a physical force. Because some inheritances don't come as gifts. They come as questions, impossible questions, with no right answers and consequences that stretch farther than anyone can see. And Margaret and Howard Walsh, two ordinary people who'd lived ordinary lives, had just been handed the most extraordinary question of all. What do you do when you discover your fortune is built on other people's crimes? The morning after their discovery, Margaret woke to find Howard already awake, sitting at the edge of their bed in the gray light of dawn, his head in his hands. She reached out and touched his shoulder, feeling the tension coiled in his muscles like wire pulled too tight. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Maybe an hour." His voice was rough, exhausted. "I keep seeing it, Margaret. All of it. Those bonds, the certificates, that letter. It's like it's burned into my brain." She understood. Every time she'd closed her eyes, she'd seen the vault, seen Edmund's careful handwriting, seen that final number, $215,400,000. The amount was so large it had stopped feeling real, like reading about astronomical distances or geological time periods. Numbers that big didn't connect to actual life, to grocery bills and mortgage payments and the cost of new tires for the Suburban. Except this was real. Terrifyingly, impossibly real. They went through the motions of their morning routine like actors playing themselves. Howard made coffee but poured too much, overfilling both mugs until they spilled onto the counter. Margaret tried to make oatmeal and forgot to add water, scorching the pot. They sat at the kitchen table, neither eating. Finally, Margaret spoke. "We need to understand what we found. Really understand it." Howard nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that. About what each piece means, what it's actually worth." He got up and returned with a legal pad and a pen. For the next 2 hours, they worked from memory, trying to recreate what they'd seen in the vault, cataloging each type of asset, estimating quantities, calculating potential values. The bearer bonds had been the most numerous. Margaret remembered at least 30 cases, each containing between 10 and 20 bonds. If the average denomination was $50,000, and there were 15 bonds per case, that was $750,000 per case. 30 cases meant $22.5 million, minimum. And some of those bonds had been for larger amounts. She was sure of it. She'd seen denominations of 100,000, even 250,000. The gold certificates were harder to estimate. They'd opened maybe 5 or 6 containers, but there had been more on the shelves. Each certificate she'd seen represented substantial gold holdings, anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000 worth at historical prices. But gold had increased dramatically in value since the 1930s. Those certificates, if they were still valid, if they could be redeemed, might be worth triple or quadruple their face value. The stock certificates were the real mystery. Margaret had studied business in college for 2 years before dropping out to get married, and she understood the basics. A share of stock purchased in 1960 for $10 might be worth hundreds or even thousands. Now, after decades of growth and stock splits, some of the certificates they'd seen were for companies that had become giants. IBM, Coca-Cola, Microsoft from its early days, Apple from before anyone knew what it would become. If Edmund had bought even 100 shares of Apple in 1980 for $22 per share, that initial investment of $2,200 would be worth hundreds of thousands now, after multiple splits and decades of growth. And the stack of Apple certificates they'd seen had been inches thick. Howard set down his pen and rubbed his eyes. Even if we're off by half, even if we're wildly overestimating, we're still talking about over $100 million. And Edmund's ledger said $215 million, Margaret added quietly. He would have known. He spent his career managing money. He'd have calculated it precisely. They sat with that reality, feeling its weight. $215 million. More money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. More money than their children and grandchildren combined would need. More money than their entire town of Pine Ridge probably generated in a year. We need to verify it, Howard said. We need to know if those documents are legitimate, if they're still valid, if they can actually be redeemed or sold. How do we do that without telling anyone what we found? Margaret asked. That was the problem. The moment they showed a single bond or certificate to anyone qualified to authenticate it, they'd be revealing the existence of the vault. And once that happened, control of the situation would slip from their hands entirely. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at their quiet street, where their neighbor was already out trimming his hedges, where the Morrisons' dog was chasing a ball across the lawn, where life continued in its normal, comfortable rhythm, completely unaware that 2 doors down, a couple held the keys to a fortune that would change everything. What if we just left it? She said suddenly. What if we sealed that vault back up and never told anyone, just walked away? Howard looked at her, surprised. You want to pretend we never found it. I don't know what I want, Margaret admitted, turning to face him. But I know this. Our life is good, Howard. We have enough. We have our health, our family, this house, each other. What do we need $200 million for? It's not about needing it, Howard said carefully. It's about what's right. That money was stolen, Margaret. Your uncle said so himself. Don't the people he stole from have a right to get it back? What people? Margaret challenged. Edmund said he took it from accounts belonging to tax evaders and criminals, from people hiding money in offshore accounts and shell corporations. Are those the people we're supposed to feel sorry for? 2 wrongs don't make a right. Maybe not. But do we owe anything to people who were breaking the law themselves? They stared at each other, the fundamental question hanging between them like smoke. The legal answer was clear. The money was stolen and should be returned or surrendered to authorities. But the moral answer was murkier, more complicated. Finally, Margaret sighed. We need more information about Edmund, about where this money really came from, about what happened to him after he disappeared with it. Howard nodded. The attorney, Richard Pembroke. He handled Edmund's estate. He might know things he couldn't put in a letter. They called Pembroke's office that afternoon and scheduled an appointment for the next day. The drive to Denver would take 3 hours, But they needed answers more than they needed rest. That night, Margaret couldn't settle. She found herself pacing the house, moving from room to room, unable to focus on anything. Around midnight, she went to her computer and opened a browser. She typed in Edmund Hartley's name. The search results surprised her. There were more entries than she'd expected. Not hundreds, but dozens. Articles from financial newspapers, archived stories from the late 1990s and early 2000s. She clicked on the first one, dated April 1998, from the Wall Street Journal. The headline read, "Investment Banker Under Investigation for Account Irregularities." The article was brief, carefully worded in the way newspapers used when lawyers were involved. It described Edmund Hartley as a senior vice president at Sterling Global Investments, a firm managing over $12 billion in assets for high-net-worth clients. Irregularities had been discovered in several accounts he'd managed. Funds appeared to have been moved without proper authorization. The amounts involved were significant but not specified. Mr. Hartley had declined to comment and had left the firm. Margaret clicked another article. This one from 6 months later. Former banker Hartley disappears as investigation deepens. This piece had more details. Federal investigators had been looking into Edmund's activities going back 2 decades. They'd discovered a complex network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and paper transactions that moved money in circles so intricate it would take years to untangle. Edmund had been scheduled for an interview with the SEC but had failed to appear. His apartment in Manhattan had been vacated. His car had been found at a long-term parking facility at JFK Airport. He'd simply vanished. The estimated amount of missing money ranged from $50 million to over $200 million, depending on which source you believed. A third article, from 2001, reported that the investigation had been quietly closed. Edmund Hartley had never been found, and after 3 years, the trail had gone completely cold. The accounts he'd manipulated belonged to foreign entities and individuals who refused to cooperate with investigators, likely because those accounts themselves were vehicles for tax evasion or money laundering. Without cooperation from the victims, prosecutors couldn't build a case, even if they found the perpetrator. Margaret sat back from the computer, her hands shaking. So Edmund hadn't just stolen money. He'd stolen it in a way designed to ensure his victims couldn't report the theft without exposing their own crimes. It was brilliant and terrible in equal measure. She printed the articles and brought them downstairs to where Howard was sitting in his chair, staring at the television without actually watching it. "He was investigated," she said, handing him the pages. "The feds were after him. That's why he disappeared. That's why he built the treehouse in the middle of nowhere and hid everything." Howard read slowly, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. When he finished, he set the articles aside and looked at her with eyes that had aged a decade in the last 24 hours. "So the government knows about him," he said. "They know he stole money. They just couldn't prove it because the victims wouldn't cooperate. And now he's dead, and we inherited his hiding place." Margaret finished. "They're going to come looking," Howard said quietly. "When they find out Edmund died and left property to someone, they're going to want to search it." Margaret felt ice settle in her stomach. "We need to decide what we're doing before that happens." The next morning, they made the drive to Denver. Richard Pembroke's office occupied the 20th floor of a glass tower downtown, with views of the mountains that would have been spectacular if Margaret had been in any state to appreciate them. Pembroke himself was in his mid-60s, with silver hair and an expensive suit that probably cost more than Margaret's entire wardrobe. but his handshake was warm, and his eyes held genuine kindness when he greeted them. "Mr. and Mrs. Walsh, please, sit. Can I offer you coffee? Water?" They declined and settled into leather chairs that were far more comfortable than anything in their own home. Pembroke sat behind his desk and folded his hands. "Waiting. We've been to the property," Margaret began. "The Treehouse. Remarkable structure, isn't it?" Pembroke said. "I visited it once, years ago, when Edmund was still alive and I was first handling his estate planning. I've never seen anything quite like it. We found something," Howard said bluntly. "Inside the structure. A hidden room." Pembroke's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. Wariness, maybe. Or confirmation of something he'd suspected. "I see," he said carefully. "Did you know it was there?" Margaret asked. Pembroke was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to say. Finally, he sighed. "I didn't know for certain, but I suspected Edmund had hidden something at that property when he hired me to set up the maintenance trust, to arrange for the caretaker, to structure the will. He was very specific about certain things. The property had to remain completely private. No one was to enter the main structure except the caretaker, and even then, only for specific maintenance tasks. All bills were to be paid from the trust automatically. No paper trail leading back to him. The behavior of someone hiding something, Howard said. "Yes," Pembroke agreed. "But Edmund was my client, and attorney-client privilege meant I couldn't speculate publicly, even if I had suspicions." "What did you know about his past?" Margaret asked. "About the investigation?" Pembroke leaned back in his chair. "Everything. He told me all of it when he first came to me in 2003. He wanted to ensure that if anything happened to him, if he died or became incapacitated, there would be a plan in place. He told me about his career in finance, about the money he'd diverted, about the federal investigation, about his decision to disappear." "And you didn't report him?" Margaret's voice carried disbelief. "I couldn't," Pembroke said. "Attorney-client privilege is absolute. Unless a client tells me they're planning to commit a future crime, I'm bound by confidentiality. Edmund's crimes were in the past. The statute of limitations had expired on some of them, and frankly, without victims willing to testify, there was no case to prosecute anyway." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "I'll tell you what I told Edmund when he first laid out his situation. What he did was wrong. Legally wrong. Morally questionable. But the people he stole from were themselves engaged in illegal activity. They'd hidden money to avoid taxes, to conceal assets in divorces, to evade creditors. Some were connected to organized crime, some to corrupt foreign governments. That doesn't make stealing from them right," Margaret said. "No," Pembroke agreed, turning back to face them. "But it makes the situation complicated. Edmund knew that. It's why he struggled with what he'd done for the last 25 years of his life. He left a letter," Howard said. "In the vault. A confession. He said the money wasn't his, that he wanted whoever found it to do something good with it." Pembroke nodded slowly. "That sounds like Edmund. He had a conscience, even if he'd violated it. That's what made him different from the usual financial criminals I've encountered. He genuinely believed he'd been fighting a corrupt system, evening scores. But as he got older, as he watched from isolation while the world changed, I think he came to see himself more clearly." "Why did he leave it to Margaret?" Howard asked. "She barely knew him." "Because she was family," Pembroke said simply. "And because, when Edmund met her, at her mother's funeral, He saw something in her. Integrity, I think. He told me once that your wife was the only person he'd ever met who seemed genuinely unburdened by greed. High praise from a man who'd spent his career watching wealthy people destroy themselves and others in pursuit of more. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She'd been 27 at her mother's funeral, exhausted from caring for a dying parent, struggling to balance her young family with the demands of hospice care. She'd barely noticed Edmund, had certainly not thought she'd made any impression on him. What's going to happen now? Margaret asked. If we report what we found, if we turn it over to authorities, what happens? Pembroke returned to his desk and pulled out a file. Legally, the property and its contents belong to you through a valid will. Edmund was never convicted of any crime. The investigation into him was closed years ago without charges. So, technically, you've inherited legal assets from a legal estate. But practically? Howard pressed. Practically, if you report finding a vault full of bearer bonds and gold certificates and vintage stocks, the federal government will seize everything pending an investigation. They'll try to prove those specific assets were stolen from specific victims. That process could take years. Meanwhile, everything would be frozen. You wouldn't be able to access any of it. And if we don't report it? Margaret asked quietly. Pembroke looked at her for a long moment. That's a question I can't answer as your attorney, because I'd be advising you to potentially break the law. What I can tell you is that bearer bonds exist specifically to be anonymous. They belong to whoever holds them, no names attached. Gold certificates from before 1933 are legal to own. Stock certificates, if properly transferred, are legitimate assets. He paused, choosing his words carefully. If someone were to very slowly, very carefully, begin converting those assets to cash through legitimate channels, through multiple brokers in different states, keeping each transaction below reporting thresholds, never drawing attention, that person could theoretically access that wealth without triggering investigations. You're telling us how to get away with keeping stolen money, Howard said flatly. I'm telling you that the legal system isn't equipped to handle cases like this, Pembroke corrected. Edmund stole from criminals who can't report the theft. He's dead and can't be prosecuted. The money has been hidden for decades, during which time the statute of limitations has expired on most of the underlying crimes. If you turn it over, it'll be tied up in legal proceedings forever, and ultimately might just end up in government coffers, rather than returning to any actual victims. He leaned forward. Or you could use it. Carefully, quietly, for good purposes. Fund your grandchildren's education. Help people in your community. Make the kind of difference Edmund always claimed he wanted to make, but never had the courage to actually attempt. Margaret and Howard sat in silence, absorbing this. Pembroke was giving them permission, tacit and carefully worded, but permission nonetheless. We need time to think, Margaret said finally. Of course. Pembroke stood, signaling the end of the meeting. But if I can offer one piece of advice, decide quickly and commit fully to whatever choice you make. Hesitation, half measures, those will destroy you faster than any federal investigation. They drove home in silence, both lost in thought. The mountains passed by the windows, indifferent to human struggles with morality and law. The sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that Margaret barely registered. Back home, they sat at their kitchen table again, the same table that had become the command center for the biggest crisis of their lives. He gave us a roadmap, Howard said. Pembroke. He basically told us how to keep it. And we'd be criminals if we did, Margaret said. Would we? Or would we just be people making use of assets that legitimately belong to us through inheritance? Assets that were stolen from criminals. They were going in circles. The same arguments, the same moral quandaries. Finally, exhausted, they agreed to sleep on it. Real sleep. Not the fitful, half-conscious dozing they'd managed the night before. But that night, around 2 a.m, Margaret woke to a sound that shouldn't be there. A car engine, idling quietly, somewhere on their street. She slipped out of bed and moved to the window, careful to stay behind the curtain. Outside, parked 3 houses down under a streetlight, sat a dark sedan. No lights on inside, but she could see the faint glow of someone smoking a cigarette, the ember flaring orange in the darkness. As she watched, a second figure in the passenger seat shifted, and the dome light briefly illuminated 2 men, both in dark clothing, both watching her house. Margaret's blood turned to ice. She backed away from the window and shook Howard awake. "Someone's out there," she whispered. "Watching the house." Howard stumbled to the window, looked out, and went very still. "That's not a neighbor's car." They watched for 15 minutes. The car didn't move. The men inside didn't get out. They just sat there, patient, observing. Finally, around 2:30, the car started up and drove slowly past their house, the driver's face briefly visible in the streetlight glow. Older, maybe mid-50s, with short hair and the kind of careful posture that suggested military or law enforcement background. After the car disappeared, Margaret and Howard went downstairs and locked every door and window. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Someone knew. Somehow, someone had found out about the treehouse, about the vault, about what they'd discovered, and that someone was watching them. The next morning brought confirmation. Margaret went to get the newspaper from the driveway and found something that hadn't been there the night before. A business card, tucked under the Suburban's windshield wiper. The card was simple, white, with black text. No logo, no decoration, just a name. Special Agent Thomas Garrett, Treasury Department, and a phone number. Margaret's hands shook as she brought it inside. Howard looked at it, and then at her, and she saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. "They know," she said. "The federal government knows about the vault." "How?" Howard demanded. "We haven't told anyone. Pembroke is bound by attorney-client privilege." Who could have told them? Margaret thought back to their conversation with Pembroke. He'd said he visited the property once, years ago, but he'd also said Edmund had hired a caretaker, someone who'd maintained the treehouse for decades. "The caretaker," she said. "When Edmund died, the trust that paid him ended. Maybe he talked. Maybe he suspected what was there and contacted authorities. Or maybe the Treasury Department had been monitoring Edmund's estate all along, waiting to see if his death would finally lead them to the money they'd never been able to find while he was alive." They stared at the business card like it was a live grenade. "We have to call him," Howard said. "If we don't, it looks like we're hiding something." "We are hiding something," Margaret said. Then, "Maybe it's time to stop." Margaret looked at her husband, at the man she'd spent 54 years building a life with. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the worry lines that had deepened over the last 3 days, the weight he was carrying that was aging him before her eyes. She thought about the vault, about $215 million in stolen money. She thought about Edmund's confession, his hope that something good might come from his crimes. She thought about their children, their grandchildren, their quiet life. In Pine Ridge, that had been simple and good and enough. And she thought about the men in the dark sedan, watching their house at 2 in the morning. "Okay," she said quietly. "We tell the truth. All of it." Howard nodded, relief washing over his face. "I'll call him." But before he could reach for the phone, it rang. They both jumped, startled. Howard answered it. "Hello?" His face went pale. He listened for a moment, then said, "Yes, we just found it. This morning." He listened again, then, 11 o'clock. "We'll be here." He hung up and looked at Margaret. "That was Agent Garrett. He's coming to the house in 3 hours to ask us some questions about property we recently inherited." Margaret sank into a chair. "So it's happening. It's happening." Howard confirmed. They had 3 hours to decide exactly how much truth to tell. 3 hours to prepare for a conversation that would determine the rest of their lives. 3 hours before the secret they'd kept for 3 days would finally be dragged into the light. Margaret went upstairs and took a long shower, letting the hot water wash over her, trying to steam out the fear and uncertainty. When she got out, she dressed carefully in her church clothes, wanting to look respectable, trustworthy. Howard did the same, putting on the suit he usually only wore for funerals and weddings. They sat at the kitchen table and made a pact. Complete honesty. No lies, no evasions, no attempts to protect themselves by concealing information. They'd tell Agent Garrett everything, from the moment they'd opened the attorney's letter to the moment they'd read Edmund's confession. And then they'd accept whatever consequences came. At exactly 11 o'clock, a knock sounded at the door. Firm, official, the knock of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Margaret opened it to find 2 people standing on her porch. The first was a man in his early 50s, tall and solid, with close-cropped hair and sharp eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they landed on. He wore a dark suit and an expression of professional neutrality. The second was a woman, younger, maybe 35, Asian, with her black hair pulled back in a severe ponytail. She carried a leather portfolio and had the kind of quiet intensity that suggested she missed nothing. "Mrs. Walsh," the man said, "I'm Special Agent Thomas Garrett with the Treasury Department, and this is Special Agent Lynn. May we come in?" Margaret stepped aside, her throat too dry to speak. The agents entered, and she saw them take in everything. The modest furniture, the family photos on the walls, the worn carpet, and old appliances. The home of people who'd never had money, who'd lived simple lives, who had no business being connected to a $200 million fortune. "Please, sit," Howard said, gesturing to the couch. The agents sat, and Agent Lynn opened her portfolio, pulling out a recording device. "Before we begin," Garrett said, "I want to be clear that this is not an interrogation. You're not under arrest. You're free to end this conversation at any time. But we're investigating certain matters related to your late uncle, Edmund Hartley, and we believe you may have information that could help us. We'll tell you everything," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We have nothing to hide." Garrett studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. Let's start at the beginning. When did you first learn about the property in the San Juan National Forest?" And so they told the story. Margaret spoke mostly, with Howard filling in details, describing the letter from the attorney, the drive to the mountains, the discovery of the treehouse. She told them about exploring the structure, finding the hidden panel, opening the vault. She described everything inside. The bearer bonds, the gold certificates, the stock papers, the cash. She told them about Edmund's ledger, about his careful documentation of everything he'd stolen. And she told them about the confession letter, about Edmund's admission of guilt, about his hope that somehow his crimes might be redeemed. When she finished, the room was silent, except for the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Agent Garrett and Agent Lynn exchanged a glance, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, Garrett spoke. "Mrs. Walsh, Mr. Walsh, I'm going to be honest with you. We've been looking for Edmund Hartley's stash for 25 years. We knew he'd taken the money. We knew roughly how much, but we could never find where he'd hidden it. When he died and we learned he'd left property to a relative, we hoped it might finally lead us to the assets." "So you've been watching us," Howard said. "We've been monitoring the situation," Garrett acknowledged. "And now that you've confirmed the vault exists and described its contents, we're going to need to seize everything as evidence." Margaret felt her heart sink, even though she'd known this was coming. "Evidence of what? Edmund's dead. You can't prosecute him." "No." Agent Lynn spoke for the first time, her voice softer than Margaret expected. "But we can attempt to return the stolen assets to their rightful owners or, if that's not possible, to the federal government." "The rightful owners," Margaret said slowly, "were criminals themselves. Edmund said so. People hiding money to avoid taxes, to conceal assets. Are those the people you're trying to help?" Garrett's expression softened slightly. "It's not about helping them, Mrs. Walsh. It's about the law. Those assets were obtained illegally, regardless of who they were stolen from. So we get nothing," Howard said flatly. "I didn't say that," Garrett replied. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Here's the situation as I see it. You inherited a property legally. You discovered something hidden there. You immediately contacted us and have cooperated fully. That speaks to your character." He paused. "Edmund Hartley was never convicted of a crime. The investigation into him was closed without charges. Legally, his estate belongs to his heirs, which is you. The assets in that vault are part of that estate. But they're stolen," Margaret said, confused. "Allegedly stolen," Garrett corrected. "And the burden of proof is on the government to demonstrate that these specific assets came from specific crimes with specific victims. That's going to be very difficult after 25 years, especially when most of the potential victims are dead or won't cooperate." Agent Lynn spoke again. "What Agent Garrett is saying is that this case is complicated. The legal proceedings could take years, and the outcome isn't certain." Margaret looked between the two agents, trying to understand what they were really telling her. "Are you saying we might actually be able to keep some of it?" "I'm saying," Garrett replied carefully, "that you should get a very good attorney, and that you should prepare for a long process. But yes, there's a possibility that after everything is sorted out, some portion of the estate might legally remain yours." He stood. "Tomorrow at noon, we'll be executing a search warrant on the Treehouse property. We'll catalog everything, photograph it, seize it as evidence. I'd recommend you be present so you can verify our inventory." "And then what?" Howard asked. "And then we begin the investigation," Garrett said. "We'll try to trace every asset, determine its origin, identify potential victims or heirs. It'll take months, possibly years. But Mrs. Walsh, Mr. Walsh, I want you to know something." He looked at them both seriously. "In my career, I've dealt with hundreds of people who discovered ill-gotten money. Most tried to hide it, to keep it, to lie about it. You didn't. You called us voluntarily. You told us the truth. That matters. Whatever happens with the legal case, I want you to know that you did the right thing." After the agents left, Margaret and Howard sat in their living room in silence. The house felt different now, exposed somehow, as if the walls had become transparent, and anyone could see inside. "We did the right thing," Margaret said, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. "We did," Howard confirmed. "Whatever happens now, at least we can sleep at night." But that night, neither of them slept well. Margaret lay awake thinking about the vault, about all those bonds and certificates that would be seized tomorrow, about the fortune that had been theirs for 3 days and now would be taken away. She thought about Edmund, alone in his mountain sanctuary, guarding his guilty treasure for decades, unable to spend it or enjoy it or find any peace with it. She thought about Sarah, the woman he'd loved, who died before they could build the life they'd dreamed of. And she thought about the choice they'd made. Truth over comfort, integrity over wealth, peace of mind over financial security. It had been the right choice. She knew that, but knowing it didn't make it feel any easier. Tomorrow, the vault would be opened again. Tomorrow, agents would catalog and photograph and seize everything Edmund had hidden. Tomorrow, the secret would become public, and their quiet lives would be disrupted in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, lying in the darkness beside Howard, Margaret made herself a promise. Whatever happened, however this turned out, she wouldn't regret the choice they'd made. Because some things were more valuable than money. Things like being able to look yourself in the mirror. Things like knowing you'd chosen the hard, right over the easy wrong. Things like integrity that couldn't be bought or sold or inherited. Edmund had left them a fortune. But in doing so, he'd also given them a test. And they'd passed it. Not by keeping the money, but by choosing to do what he'd been unable to do for 25 years. Tell the truth, and let the consequences fall where they would. That was worth more than $215 million. At least, Margaret told herself as she finally drifted toward uneasy sleep. She hoped it was. The morning of the search warrant execution, Margaret and Howard arrived at the Treehouse to find the clearing transformed into something resembling a crime scene. 5 black SUVs were parked in a semicircle, their government plates glinting in the pale sunlight. Men and women in dark suits moved with purpose, setting up portable lights and tables, organizing equipment cases, speaking into radios with the clipped efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. Agent Garrett met them at the base of the spiral stairs, his expression professional but not unkind. "Mr. and Mrs. Walsh, thank you for coming. This should take most of the day. You're welcome to observe, but please, don't interfere with the process." Margaret nodded, unable to speak. She felt like she was attending a funeral, watching strangers dismantle something sacred. The vault had been opened before they arrived. Through the hidden panel, Margaret could see agents inside with cameras and laptops, methodically photographing each item, scanning documents, entering data into databases. Every bond was photographed from multiple angles. Every certificate was examined under magnification. Every gold coin was weighed and catalogued. A young agent emerged, carrying one of the leather cases. The one Margaret had first opened, that contained the $50,000 bearer bonds. He set it on a table where 2 more agents began processing it, their gloved hands handling the documents with the care usually reserved for museum artifacts. "It's really real," Howard whispered beside her. "I think part of me still didn't believe it until now." Margaret understood. Seeing federal agents treat the contents of the vault with such serious attention made the fortune's existence undeniable. This wasn't a dream or a mistake. Edmund had really stolen over $200 million, had really hidden it in a tree, had really left it to her. By noon, a white van arrived with evidence recovery stenciled on the side. Agents began loading the sealed cases, each one labeled and inventoried, into the climate-controlled interior. Margaret watched case after case disappear, each one representing wealth beyond her comprehension, all of it slipping through her fingers like water. Agent Lynn approached with a clipboard. "Mrs. Walsh, we'll need you to sign the inventory. It confirms that you witnessed the seizure and agree to the item count." Margaret took the clipboard with numb fingers. The inventory ran to 12 pages. Single-spaced. Bearer bonds. Quantity 347. Various denominations. Gold certificates. Quantity 216. Stock certificates. Various companies. Quantity 1,862. On and on it went. A catalogue of Edmund's decades of careful theft. She signed, her handwriting shakier than usual. "What happens now?" she asked Agent Lynn. "The assets will be stored in a federal facility while we conduct our investigation," Lynn explained. "We'll attempt to trace the origins of each item, match them to specific accounts or victims if possible. It's a complex process. The forensic accounting alone could take 6 months. And then various parties will likely file claims. The government, potential victims or their heirs, maybe even the banks Edmund worked for. There'll be legal proceedings to determine the disposition of the assets." "How long?" Agent Lynn's expression was sympathetic. "Cases like this? 2 to 3 years. Minimum. Maybe longer." Margaret felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. 2 to 3 years of legal limbo, of uncertainty, of not knowing whether they'd end up with anything or nothing. By late afternoon, the vault was empty. The evidence van drove away, followed by most of the SUVs. Only Agent Garrett remained, standing on the deck of the treehouse with Margaret and Howard, looking out over the forest as the sun began its descent toward the mountain peaks. "For what it's worth," Garrett said quietly, "I think Edmund would be relieved. He carried this secret for 25 years. Now it's finally out in the open." "Will his name be made public?" Margaret asked. "Will people know what he did?" "Yes," Garrett said. "We'll have to file court documents detailing the seizure and the investigation. Once those are public record, the media will pick it up. I'd prepare yourself for attention." He wasn't wrong. The first news story appeared online that evening. Federal agents seized $200 million in suspected stolen assets from Colorado mountain property. The article was light on details, but heavy on speculation. By morning, it had been picked up by every major news outlet in the state. By the second day, reporters had found Margaret and Howard's address. The first knock came at 7 in the morning. Margaret opened the door to find a young woman with a camera crew. "Mrs. Walsh, I'm Jennifer Ross from Channel 9 News. Can you comment on the fortune found at your property? Did you have any idea what your uncle had hidden?" Margaret closed the door without answering. The second knock came 20 minutes later. Then a third. By noon, there were 5 news vans parked on their quiet street, satellite dishes pointing at the sky like mechanical flowers seeking sun. Howard closed all the curtains. They sat in artificial twilight, listening to their phone ring constantly, watching through the gaps in the curtains as neighbors gathered on lawns, pointing at their house, talking among themselves. "We can't stay here," Margaret said. "Not like this." They packed bags and drove to their daughter Jessica's house in Boulder, 2 hours away. Jessica was horrified when she heard the full story, which Margaret and Howard finally told over coffee at her kitchen table while her children were at school. "Mom," Jessica said, her voice stunned. "You found $200 million and didn't tell us?" "It's not ours," Margaret said. "It was stolen. We had to report it. But if Uncle Edmund left it to you legally, it doesn't matter how legal the inheritance was if the assets themselves are stolen." Howard interrupted. "We did the right thing." Jessica looked at her parents, her expression shifting from shock to understanding to something like pride. "You did. But Mom, Dad, you need to prepare yourselves. Once this becomes public knowledge, everyone's going to want a piece of it." She was right. The letters started arriving 3 days later, forwarded from their Pine Ridge address. Letters from lawyers representing unnamed clients claiming to be victims of Edmund's theft. Letters from people claiming to be distant relatives, suddenly remembering family connections. Letters from con artists and opportunists, some threatening, some pleading, all wanting something. One letter, postmarked from New York, was different. The envelope was expensive. The letterhead, embossed with gold. The law firm was Keating, Morrison, and Shaw. One of those names that carried weight. Howard opened it and read aloud. "Dear Mrs. Walsh, we represent the interests of the Castellano Family Trust. Our investigation indicates that your uncle, Edmund Hartley, managed several accounts on behalf of our clients in the 1980s and 90s. Significant assets from those accounts were diverted and never recovered. We believe the seized assets include property rightfully belonging to our clients. We intend to file a claim for full restitution. And we strongly advise you to retain counsel." Margaret felt ice settle in her stomach. The Castellano family. Why does that name sound familiar? Jessica, who'd been listening, went pale. "Mom." The Castellanos were one of the biggest organized crime families in New York in the 80s. They ran gambling, drugs, protection rackets. The FBI spent decades trying to bring them down. "Edmund stole from the mafia," Howard said slowly, the full implications sinking in. Another letter arrived the next day. This one less formal. Plain envelope, no return address. A single page with a typed message. "People who mess with money that isn't theirs tend to have accidents. Think carefully about what you claim is yours." Margaret's hands shook as she held it. "This is a threat. We need to call Agent Garrett," Howard said, reaching for his phone. But before he could dial, Jessica's doorbell rang. All three of them froze. Jessica moved to the window and peered out carefully. "It's okay," she said. "It's just a guy in a regular car. Looks like—" She opened the door. The man standing there was in his late 60s, wearing jeans and a windbreaker, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked familiar, but Margaret couldn't place him. "Mrs. Walsh," he said, "I'm sorry to show up unannounced. My name is David Chen. I worked with your Uncle Edmund at Sterling Global back in the 90s. I saw the news, and I thought you might need someone to talk to. Someone who knew him. Someone. Margaret studied him, suspicious after the threatening letter, but something in his face suggested genuine concern rather than ulterior motive. "How did you find me?" she asked. "I'm a forensic accountant," Chen said with a slight smile. "Finding people is part of what I do. May I come in? I promise I'm not here to threaten you or claim anything. I just thought you should know some things about Edmund that never made it into the official investigations." They invited him in, though Howard kept himself positioned between Chen and Margaret, protective. Chen sat at Jessica's kitchen table and accepted the coffee she offered. I worked under Edmund for 3 years, Chen began. He was brilliant, the best I've ever seen at untangling complex financial structures, but he was also troubled. He'd seen too much, done too much, and it was eating him alive. Did you know he was stealing? Howard asked bluntly. Chen was quiet for a moment, then nodded. I suspected. There were accounts that didn't quite add up, transactions that were too clean, too perfectly hidden. But I couldn't prove anything. And, honestly, I was young and scared for my own career. So I stayed quiet. Why are you here now? Margaret asked. Because you need to understand what you're dealing with, Chen said, his expression grave. The money Edmund took didn't just come from tax cheats and offshore accounts. Some of it came from very dangerous people. The Castellanos, yes, but others too. Russian oligarchs, South American cartels, Middle Eastern arms dealers. People who used legitimate investment firms to launder dirty money. Margaret felt the room spinning. Edmund stole from drug cartels. He stole from anyone he considered corrupt, Chen said. And in his view, that was almost everyone with significant wealth. But the problem is, some of those people are still alive, still powerful, and still very interested in recovering what they consider theirs. The threatening letter, Howard said, pulling it from his pocket and sliding it across the table. Chen read it, and his face darkened. This is exactly what I was afraid of. Mrs. Walsh, Mr. Walsh, you need to understand something. The legal proceedings, the government investigation, those are the least of your worries. The real danger comes from the people who can't go through legal channels because their money was illegal to begin with. What are we supposed to do? Margaret asked, hearing the fear in her own voice. You need protection, Chen said. And you need someone who understands the financial underworld to help you navigate this. I'd like to offer my services, free of charge. I owe Edmund that much for staying silent when I should have spoken up. Jessica spoke up. Why should we trust you? Chen pulled out his wallet and extracted a business card and a photo. The card identified him as a certified forensic accountant and fraud investigator. The photo showed a much younger Chen standing beside Edmund in what looked like an office, both smiling, both holding coffee cups in a casual moment. Edmund was my mentor, Chen said quietly. He taught me everything I know about following money trails. When he disappeared, I spent years wondering if I could have stopped him, if I should have reported my suspicions earlier. I can't change the past, but maybe I can help his family now. Margaret looked at Howard, who gave a small nod. Some instinct told her Chen was genuine, that his offer came from guilt and loyalty, rather than greed or ulterior motive. Okay, she said. Help us. Over the next week, Chen became their guide through the nightmare. He reviewed the threatening letter and confirmed it likely came from associates of the Castellano family, who were now mostly legitimate business people, trying to distance themselves from their criminal past. Having stolen money traced back to them would be embarrassing and potentially legally dangerous. He explained that the Russian oligarchs, whose accounts Edmund had raided in the 90s, were now even more powerful and definitely more ruthless. Some had connections to the Kremlin itself. The good news, Chen said during one of their meetings in Jessica's living room, is that most of these people can't act openly. They can threaten, they can intimidate, but actually harming you would draw too much attention. The federal investigation protects you somewhat. Somewhat isn't very reassuring, Howard muttered. Chen's phone buzzed. He checked it, and his expression changed. We have a problem. The Castellano lawyers just filed a claim in federal court. They're alleging that over 80 million of the seized assets came directly from accounts Edmund managed for them. Can they prove it? Margaret asked. That's the question, Chen said. And that's where things get interesting. When Pommet 17.7, Unpommet 17.7, 17.7, Unpommet 17.17.7, to prove those assets are theirs, they'd have to provide documentation showing Edmund managed those accounts. But those documents would also prove they were using Sterling Global to launder money. It's a catch-22, so they can't actually claim it. Hope flickered in Margaret's voice. They can try, Chen said. But the government will fight them. The Treasury Department would love nothing more than to seize $80 million from the Castellanos, even if they can't prosecute them for the underlying crimes. Margaret's phone rang. It was Agent Garrett. She answered on speaker. Mrs. Walsh. Garrett's voice was tense. I need to inform you that we've received 4 separate claims on the seized assets. The Castellanos, a group of Russian businessmen, a Colombian conglomerate, and a consortium of Swiss banks. The total claims exceed the actual value of the assets by about $200 million. What does that mean? Margaret asked. It means everyone wants a piece. And they're all claiming they're owed more than actually exists. This is going to get very complicated. Very quickly. I'm recommending you retain legal counsel immediately if you haven't already. And Mrs. Walsh, I need to ask, have you been threatened? Margaret hesitated, then said, Yes. We received a threatening letter. A.T. Garrett swore softly. I need you to send that to me immediately. And I'm going to recommend you accept protective monitoring. We can't provide full-time security, but we can increase patrols around wherever you're staying, maybe install some surveillance. We're at our daughter's house, Margaret said. Then stay there. Don't go back to Pine Ridge until this settles down. And Mrs. Walsh, be very careful who you trust. After hanging up, Margaret looked at Chen, who'd heard everything. He said to be careful who we trust. IB's news. He's right, Chen said. And that includes me. You should verify everything I've told you. But right now, I think I can help with something immediate. We need to review Edmund's ledger, the one that was in the vault. Do you remember what it said? The feds seized it, Howard said. But you saw it, right? Do you remember any details? Specific amounts? Dates? Account numbers? Margaret closed her eyes, trying to recall. She'd been so overwhelmed that day, but some things had stuck. He listed everything by category. Bearer bonds were Section A through C. Gold certificates were D through F. But there were notes in the margins. Things like C Family, 1987, and Moscow Acquisition, 1993. Chen's eyes lit up. That's good. That's very good. He was tracking where each asset came from. If we can reconstruct that, we might be able to help the government figure out which claims are legitimate and which are opportunistic. Why would we want to help them figure that out? Jessica asked. If everyone's fighting over the money, doesn't that work in Mom and Dad's favor? No, Chen said, because the longer this drags out, the more dangerous it becomes. We need resolution. Fast. The best way to get that is to help untangle the mess so the government can make decisions and close the case. What happens next will turn this financial nightmare into something even darker, revealing the true extent of Edmund's crimes and forcing Margaret and Howard to make a choice that could save their lives or destroy everything they've built. The truth about who Edmund really was and what he did with that fortune will shock them to their core, and prove that some secrets should never be uncovered. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Over the next 2 weeks, Chen worked with Margaret and Howard to reconstruct as much of Edmund's ledger as they could remember. They met in Jessica's dining room, the table covered with timelines and notes, trying to piece together decades of financial crime. Chen made a discovery that changed everything. "Look at this," he said one evening, pointing to a timeline they'd built. "Edmund's stealing follows a pattern. Every time he took a significant amount from one source, he'd immediately move it into bearer bonds or gold certificates. Why would he do that? To make it untraceable," Howard suggested. "Partially. But there's another reason. Bearer bonds and gold certificates from before 1933 can't be traced electronically. They're physical objects. That means if the original owners tried to claim them, they'd have to prove physical possession at some point. But Edmund took the physical documents, so there's no proof. He was covering his tracks," Margaret said. "More than that. He was making it impossible for the people he stole from to claim anything without admitting they'd been hiding money illegally in the first place." Chen leaned back, his expression troubled. Edmund wasn't just stealing. He was engineering a financial trap. Anyone who tried to get their money back would have to confess to crimes. "That's brilliant," Jessica said, then immediately looked guilty. "I mean, morally terrible, but strategically brilliant. It's also dangerous," Chen said, "because it means everyone who lost money to Edmund had a reason to want him dead. And now that he's gone and the money's been found, they have a reason to want revenge on his heir." As if summoned by that observation, headlights swept across Jessica's front window. A car had pulled up outside, idling. Margaret moved to look and saw a black Mercedes with tinted windows. "That's been there 3 times this week," Jessica said quietly. "Always at night, always for about 20 minutes. Then it leaves." "You didn't tell us that," Howard said, his voice sharp with concern. "I didn't want to worry you more than you already were." Chen stood and moved to the window, careful to stay behind the curtain. "That's not law enforcement. Wrong car, wrong behavior. They'd either come to the door or stay hidden. This is intimidation. Someone wants you to know you're being watched." Howard grabbed his phone. "I'm calling Garrett." But before he could dial, Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "The money isn't yours. Walk away, or your family pays the price." Her hands shook so badly she dropped the phone. Chen picked it up, read the message, and his face went hard. "That's direct threat. We need to escalate this now." The next 24 hours became a blur of law enforcement activity. Agent Garrett arrived with a full team. They installed security cameras at Jessica's house, set up monitoring on everyone's phones, and assigned protection details. The black Mercedes never returned, but the threat had been made clear. A meeting was called at the Denver FBI field office. Margaret and Howard sat in a conference room with Agent Garrett, Agent Lin, an FBI agent named Morrison, and Chen, who'd been cleared to participate as their financial consultant. "Let's lay everything out," Morrison said. He was older, maybe 60, with gray hair and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much. "We've now identified credible threats from 3 separate criminal organizations: the Castellano family, the Volkov group out of Russia, and a Colombian operation run by a man named Esteban Ruiz." He pulled up photos on a screen. The first showed a distinguished older man in an expensive suit, Victor Castellano. Officially, he's a real estate developer and philanthropist. Unofficially, his family made hundreds of millions through organized crime in the 80s and 90s. They've spent the last 20 years cleaning up their image. The second photo showed a heavy-set man with cold eyes. Dmitry Volkov, Russian oligarch, close ties to the Kremlin, suspected of everything from arms dealing to human trafficking. Nothing proven. Nothing prosecuted. The third photo was of a handsome man in his 50s with a calculating smile. Esteban Ruiz runs what looks like a legitimate import-export business. Actually runs cocaine through 3 countries. Very dangerous, very smart. These are the people who want our money, Margaret said, her voice hollow. Not just the money, Morrison corrected. They want you to disappear quietly so they can fight over the assets without witnesses complicating things. As long as you're the legal heir making a claim, you're an obstacle. So what do we do? Howard demanded. Hide for the rest of our lives. No, Chen said, and everyone turned to look at him. We give them what they want. Excuse me. Garrett's voice was sharp. Chen leaned forward. Not the money. We can't give them that, and they know it's been seized. But we can give them something better. Information. Specifically, we can help prove that their money was illegal, which means they can't claim it without confessing to crimes. How does that help us? Margaret asked. Because once they understand they can't win, they'll stop trying. Right now, they're operating on the belief that maybe, somehow, they can recover their assets. We need to make it clear that any attempt to claim the money will result in prosecution. Morrison nodded slowly. You want to use the claimant's own greed against them. Force them to choose between recovering money and staying out of prison. Exactly, Chen said. And I think I know how to do it. But I'll need access to the seized assets documentation. Specifically, I need to see account numbers, transaction records, anything that traces the money to its sources. Garrett and Morrison exchanged glances. Finally, Garrett said, that would be highly irregular. Those are evidence in an ongoing investigation. I have top-level security clearance from my work with the Treasury Department on other fraud cases, Chen said, and I'm willing to work under direct supervision. But Mrs. Walsh is right to be afraid. These people will keep escalating until they either get what they want or realize they can't have it. We need to force that realization before someone gets hurt. After more discussion, Morrison agreed. Chen would be given limited access to the seized documentation under strict supervision. He'd have 1 week to build a case proving that the major claimants couldn't legally recover their assets without self-incrimination. Chen spent that week living in a secure federal facility, working 18-hour days reviewing documents. Margaret and Howard stayed at Jessica's house under protection, waiting for news. On the 6th day, Chen emerged with a 300-page report. He presented it at another meeting. This one, including not just federal agents, but also federal prosecutors. Here's what I found, Chen said, pulling up a complex diagram on the screen. Edmund didn't just steal randomly. He created a web. He'd take money from the Castellanos and move it through accounts connected to the Volkov group. Then he'd take money from Volkov and route it through Ruiz's accounts. He deliberately cross-contaminated everything. Why? Garrett asked. So that anyone trying to claim their money would have to explain connections to other criminal organizations. If Castellano claims account X, he has to explain why his money was mixed with Volkov's. If Volkov claims account Y, he has to explain the Colombian connection. Chen pulled up another slide. More than that, Edmund kept meticulous records, hidden records, encrypted files that I was able to decrypt from recovered hard drives. Those records document exactly who owned what, when transactions occurred, and what crimes were being concealed. He looked directly at Margaret and Howard. Your uncle created insurance. He documented everything so that if anyone ever came after him or his heir, those records could be released. Every major claimant would be exposed and prosecuted. That's leverage, Morrison said, understanding dawning. Exactly. And here's what we're going to do with it. The plan was simple but risky. The federal prosecutors would contact the legal representatives of each major claimant and make them an offer. Withdraw your claims and walk away, or we release Edmund's documentation showing your money was criminal proceeds. Either way, you're not getting the money back. But if you walk away, you avoid prosecution. They'll never agree, Howard said. These are powerful people. They'll call the bluff. It's not a bluff, Chen said quietly. I've already prepared the documentation for release. If they don't withdraw, we publish everything. The Castellanos' connection to 1980s mob activity, Volkov's money laundering schemes, Ruiz's cocaine financing. All of it. Documented, proven, ready for prosecution. Margaret felt something shift inside her. For 2 weeks, she'd felt like prey, hunted and helpless. But Chen was offering them a weapon. Not money, but information. The truth about where Edmund's fortune had really come from. Documented so thoroughly that even powerful criminals would have to back down. Do it, she said firmly. Whatever it takes to end this. The offers went out that afternoon. For 3 days, nothing happened. The tension was unbearable. Then, one by one, the responses came. The Castellano lawyers withdrew their claim, citing inability to provide necessary documentation. The Volkov Group's representatives went silent. Their claim simply abandoned. Ruiz's attorneys filed a formal withdrawal, stating their client no longer wished to pursue the matter. Within a week, all major claims had been dropped. The smaller, opportunistic claims remained, but without the big players driving the process. Those would be easier to handle through normal legal channels. Agent Garrett called Margaret with the news. It worked. The serious threats have backed off. We'll maintain some level of monitoring for a few more weeks, but I think the immediate danger has passed. Margaret hung up and immediately broke down crying. Howard held her while she shook, releasing weeks of accumulated fear and tension. Jessica brought them tea and sat with them in silence, understanding that sometimes the only response to overwhelming relief was tears. That evening, Chen came by for a final meeting. The government is proceeding with their case, but without opposition from major claimants, it should move faster. I'd estimate 18 months instead of 3 years. And Mrs. Walsh, there's something else you should know. X-Plice, X-Plice, X-Plice Day, X-Plice. He pulled out a file. I found one more thing in Edmund's encrypted files. A letter, written about a year before he died. It's addressed to you. Margaret took the file with trembling hands and opened it. Inside was a printed document, clearly scanned from a handwritten original. Edmund's handwriting, shakier than in the earlier letter but still legible. Dear Margaret, it began. If you're reading this through my accountant friend David Chen, then things have gone the way I planned. The threats came, the criminals revealed themselves, and Chen helped you use my final insurance policy to protect yourself. I spent 25 years building that insurance. I knew that whoever inherited my burden would need protection from people far more dangerous than federal agents. So I documented everything, created a web so complex that anyone trying to claim a piece would incriminate themselves. I don't expect forgiveness for what I did. I stole. I lied. I hid for decades like a coward. But in doing so, I learned every dirty secret of some of the world's most dangerous people. And now those secrets are yours to wield if you need them. Use them wisely. Use them to protect yourself and your family. And if possible, use whatever remains of my stolen fortune to do the good I always claimed I wanted to do but never had the courage to attempt. You barely knew me in life. But I knew you, my sister's daughter, honest and kind and strong in ways I never was. I'm trusting you with more than money. I'm trusting you with the truth about people who've hurt countless others. Make sure that truth counts for something. With hope and regret, Edmund. Margaret looked up at Chen, who'd been watching her read. You knew him. At the end, you were the accountant friend he mentioned. Chen nodded. He reached out to me about 5 years ago, asked me to help him organize his documentation, to set up the encryption, to create a plan for whoever inherited everything. He never told me who that would be, but he said they'd need help. So I've been watching, waiting for the news of his death and the discovery of the vault. Why didn't you tell us this from the start? Howard asked. Because I needed to see if you were who Edmund thought you were. If you'd tried to hide the money, keep it for yourselves, lie about it, I would have walked away. But you reported it immediately. You told the truth even when it cost you. That told me Edmund chose correctly. Jessica spoke up. So, what happens now? Chen smiled slightly. Now, the boring part. Legal proceedings, asset distribution, probably a year of paperwork and court dates. But the danger is over. The people who might have hurt you to get at the money have all realized they can't claim it without destroying themselves. He stood to leave, then paused. Mrs. Walsh, your uncle was a complicated man. He did terrible things for reasons he believed were justified. But in the end, he tried to protect you from the consequences of his actions. I think that counts for something. After Chen left, Margaret sat with Howard and Jessica in the quiet house, holding Edmund's letter. Outside, the protection detail maintained their watch, but the black Mercedes didn't return. The threatening texts stopped. The intimidating phone calls ceased. The immediate crisis had passed. But Margaret knew their lives had been permanently altered. They'd touched a fortune and been forced to let it go, had faced threats from some of the world's most dangerous people, had learned things about wealth and power and corruption that most people never saw. And somehow, through it all, they'd maintained their integrity. They'd chosen truth over wealth, honesty over safety, principles over profit. That night, as Margaret finally fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, she thought about Edmund's final words. He'd trusted her with more than money. He'd trusted her with truth, with secrets, with the power to destroy people who deserved destruction. It was a strange inheritance, but in its own way more valuable than any fortune, because money could be stolen, seized, or spent, but truth, once known, could never be unknown. And sometimes truth was the most powerful weapon of all. Tomorrow, they'd begin the long process of resolving the legal case, of determining what, if anything, they might ultimately receive from Edmund's stolen fortune. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, they could sleep without fear. The dangerous territory had been crossed. The threats had been neutralized, and Margaret and Howard Walsh, two ordinary people from a small mountain town, had survived something that would have destroyed most people. They'd survived because they'd refused to let fear or greed compromise who they were. And that, Margaret realized as sleep finally claimed her, was worth more than $215 million could ever be. 18 months passed like a slow-turning wheel. Autumn became winter. Winter melted into spring. Spring blossomed into summer. And the seasons cycled again, while lawyers argued, and judges deliberated, and federal accountants untangled decades of financial crimes. Margaret and Howard returned to Pine Ridge, to their modest ranch house on Elm Street, and tried to rebuild some semblance of normal life. But normal had shifted. Their neighbors, who'd once waved from porches and stopped to chat about the weather, now looked at them differently. Some with suspicion, wondering if they'd somehow been complicit in Edmund's crimes. Others with barely concealed envy, imagining vast wealth hidden away despite all evidence to the contrary. A few with genuine kindness, understanding that being connected to $200 million in stolen money was more curse than blessing. Margaret threw herself into routine, the same routines that had structured her life for decades. Tuesday was grocery shopping at the Safeway on Main Street. Wednesday was quilting circle at the community center. Thursday was volunteering at the library, shelving books, and helping patrons find what they needed. Sunday was church, sitting in the same pew her family had occupied for 42 years. But even these familiar rituals felt different now. At the grocery store, the cashier who'd rung up her purchases for 15 years now asked prying questions. "Must be nice, having all that money coming your way." Margaret would smile tightly and say nothing, paying with the same worn credit card she'd always used, the one with a $500 limit that she paid off religiously every month. At quilting circle, conversations would pause when she entered, then resume with forced brightness. Once, she'd overheard Betty Simmons whisper to Patricia Dean, "I heard they're getting millions. Millions! And they won't share a dime with anyone who knew them when they were poor." Margaret had left early that day, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed in public. Howard retreated to his workshop, spending hours building birdhouses and small tables with the same focused precision he'd brought to construction work for 5 decades. Sometimes Margaret would bring him coffee and find him just sitting, staring at his tools, his hands idle for once. The waiting was wearing on him in ways he wouldn't admit, aging him faster than time alone could account for. They didn't talk about the money much. What was there to say? It existed, locked away in federal custody, while lawyers and judges decided its fate. Talking about it only made the waiting harder. David Chen called every few weeks with updates. Claims were being processed. Some assets had been successfully traced to specific crimes and would be forfeited to the government. Others remained in legal limbo, ownership uncertain. The smaller opportunistic claims were being dismissed one by one, each claimant unable to provide sufficient documentation to support their assertions. "It's moving forward," Chen would say. "Slower than I'd like, but forward." Then, on a crisp October morning, exactly 18 months after the vault had been discovered, Margaret's phone rang. Richard Pembroke, the estate attorney, his voice carrying barely contained excitement. "Mrs. Walsh, the judge has issued his ruling. Can you and Howard come to my office tomorrow? I'd rather discuss this in person." The drive to Denver the next day felt longer than usual, each mile stretched by anticipation and dread mixed in equal measure. They barely spoke, each lost in private thoughts about what the ruling might mean. Everything? Nothing? Something in between? Pembroke's office looked the same as it had 18 months ago, but Margaret and Howard had aged. Their reflections in the conference room's polished table showed deeper lines, more gray hair, eyes that had seen things they couldn't unsee. Pembroke entered with Chen and Agent Garrett, an unusual trio that made Margaret's heart skip. Good news or bad? It was clearly significant. "Let me cut to the chase," Pembroke said, sitting and opening a thick folder. "The judge has ruled that approximately 68% of the seized assets, roughly $146 million, are proven proceeds of crime and will be forfeited to the federal government. Those funds will be distributed among verified victims, where possible, and the remainder will go to the Federal Crime Victims Fund." Margaret felt her stomach drop. 68% gone. But that meant the remaining 32%. Pembroke continued. Approximately $69 million cannot be definitively traced to criminal activity. The accounts Edmund managed were so convoluted, so deliberately obscured, that proving the origins of every asset is impossible. In the absence of proof, and given that Edmund was never convicted of any crime during his lifetime, those assets legally belong to his estate, which means they belong to you, Mrs. Walsh. The room tilted. $69 million. Not the full fortune, but an amount so staggering that Margaret couldn't process it. She looked at Howard and saw her own shock mirrored on his face. "However," Pembroke said, and Margaret's brief moment of dizziness snapped into focus. There was always a however. "There are conditions." The judge was very clear. He noted that while the inheritance is legal, the probable origin of the funds creates moral complications. As such, he's requiring that the assets be placed in a restricted trust. "What does that mean?" Howard asked, his voice rough. Chen leaned forward. "It means you can't just take the money and spend it on yourselves. The trust can only be used for specific purposes: charitable giving, educational funding, community development, healthcare access. Basically, anything that serves the public good. You can draw a modest salary as trustees, enough to live comfortably but not extravagantly. But the bulk of the money must be used to help others." Agent Garrett spoke for the first time. The judge essentially said that Edmund stole from criminals and the wealthy to give to the poor. At least that was his claimed intention. This ruling forces that intention to become reality. The money will finally do what Edmund always said he wanted it to do. Margaret sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. $69 million, but not really theirs. Held in trust, restricted, designated for charity. It was more money than she'd ever dreamed of touching. But she couldn't use it to buy a new house, or a fancy car, or vacations in Europe. She could only use it to help people. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep in her chest, surprising everyone, including herself. It built until she was laughing so hard tears streamed down her face. Howard stared at her, concerned. But then he started laughing too, understanding dawning. "Edmund," Margaret gasped between laughs. "He finally did it. He finally found a way to make his theft meaningful, by dying and leaving it to someone who'd be forced to do what he never could." Pembroke smiled. "That's one way to look at it." "When can we access the funds?" Howard asked, wiping his eyes. "The trust will be established within 30 days. You'll have full discretion over how the money is distributed, subject to annual audits, to ensure compliance with the charitable restrictions. I'd recommend forming a foundation, hiring a small staff, and developing a clear mission statement. This isn't something you want to do casually." Chen added, "I've already prepared some preliminary recommendations for structure and governance, if you're interested. And I'd like to offer my services again, this time as your foundation's financial advisor, paid, but below market rate, I owe Edmund that much. That evening, back in Pine Ridge, Margaret and Howard sat at their kitchen table with notepads and pens, trying to absorb what had happened. They had access to $69 million, but couldn't spend it on themselves. They were millionaires who had to live on a trustee's salary. They'd inherited a fortune that came with the responsibility to give it all away. "How do you even begin?" Margaret said, staring at the blank notepad. $69 million. Where do we start? Howard was quiet for a long moment, then said, "We start here, in Pine Ridge, with people we know who need help." Margaret looked at him, understanding flooding through her. The Johnsons lost their farm last year to medical debt. Tom's cancer treatment bankrupted them. The high school needs a new roof, Howard added. They've been doing bake sales for 3 years, trying to raise money. Sarah Chen, no relation to David, she's brilliant. Got accepted to MIT, but her family can't afford the tuition. They started writing, and once they started, they couldn't stop. Names, needs, dreams deferred because of money. The single mother, working 3 jobs, who needed reliable childcare. The veteran who couldn't afford the surgery that would ease his chronic pain. The community center that needed updating. The library that had no budget for new books. By midnight, they'd filled 6 pages with ideas. Small things, mostly. Individual needs that would barely make a dent in $69 million. But each one represented a life that could be changed. A burden that could be lifted. A dream that could be realized. "This is how we do it," Margaret said softly. "Not grand gestures or buildings with our names on them. Just helping people, one at a time, the way neighbors used to help neighbors before everything got so complicated." Over the next 3 months, they worked with Chen and Pembroke to establish the Sarah Hartley Foundation, named for the woman Edmund had loved and lost. The mission statement was simple: to provide direct financial assistance and opportunity to individuals and families in rural mountain communities, honoring the belief that everyone deserves a chance to build a better life. Margaret became the foundation's president. Howard was named vice president. They hired Jessica, their daughter, as executive director, bringing her non-profit management experience to bear. Chen became the financial advisor, and they recruited 3 other board members from Pine Ridge: a retired teacher, a local business owner, and the pastor from their church. The foundation's office was established in a converted storefront on Pine Ridge's Main Street, right between the hardware store and the diner. Nothing fancy, just clean space with desks and filing cabinets, and a big window where people could see in. See that this was real and accessible. They set up a simple application process. Anyone in Pine Ridge or the surrounding mountain communities could apply for assistance. Medical bills, education costs, home repairs, business startup capital, emergency expenses. The board reviewed applications weekly and distributed funds based on need and impact. The first grant went to Tom Johnson, covering the remaining medical debt from his cancer treatment and saving his farm. Margaret delivered the check personally, sitting at his kitchen table while Tom's wife cried tears of relief and gratitude. "Why us?" Tom asked, his voice hoarse. "We're nobody special." "That's exactly why," Margaret said gently. "Because everyone is special, and no one should lose everything because they got sick." The second grant funded the high school's new roof. The third paid for Sarah Chen's first year at MIT. The fourth helped the single mother, Patricia Reeves, start a home daycare business that would support her family and help other working parents. Word spread quickly. At first, people were suspicious. "There's got to be a catch," was the common refrain, but there wasn't. No political requirements, no religious strings, no expectations of anything beyond using the money as intended. Applications poured in, not just from Pine Ridge but from tiny towns throughout the Colorado mountains. Places like Creed and Lake City and Silverton, communities so small they barely showed on maps, where a few $1,000s could change someone's entire life trajectory. Within 6 months, the foundation had distributed $3 million, paid off medical debt for 47 families, funded college education for 18 students, helped 12 small businesses get started or stay afloat, repaired homes for 23 elderly residents, provided emergency assistance to countless others. But Margaret insisted they do more than just write checks. She wanted to address systemic issues, not just symptoms. So the foundation funded a free medical clinic in Pine Ridge, staffed by a rotating team of doctors and nurses who volunteered time. They established a financial literacy program, teaching people how to budget, save, and avoid the debt traps that destroyed so many families. They created a small business incubator, providing not just capital, but mentorship and resources. The Treehouse became the foundation's retreat center. Margaret couldn't bear to sell it or abandon it, despite the dark history buried in its walls. Instead, she transformed it. The vault was permanently sealed and marked with a plaque. Here lay secrets that caused harm. Now, this place is devoted to healing. The Treehouse itself became a sanctuary for people in crisis. Women escaping domestic violence could stay there safely. Families dealing with tragedy could retreat there to grieve and heal. Students could use it for quiet study during exam periods. Artists could apply for residencies, spending weeks in the forest, creating and thinking. Margaret hired a caretaker, a young woman named Emma, who'd lost her own home to fire and needed both employment and purpose. Emma lived in a small cottage on the property and maintained the Treehouse with the same devotion someone else had shown for decades. The transformation of Pine Ridge happened slowly, so gradually that at first no one noticed. But after a year, the changes became undeniable. The high school's test scores improved because students weren't working full-time jobs to help their families anymore. They could focus on education. The downtown area revitalized as new businesses opened, funded by foundation microloans. The medical clinic reduced emergency room visits by 40% because people could get preventive care. Crime dropped. Teen pregnancy rates fell. College attendance from Pine Ridge graduates tripled. The town that had been slowly dying, losing population to economic decline, began to stabilize and even grow as young families stayed instead of fleeing to cities. But it wasn't just about statistics. It was about individual transformations that rippled outward. Sarah Chen graduated from MIT and returned to Pine Ridge to teach at the high school, inspiring a new generation. Tom Johnson started a mentorship program for young farmers. Patricia Reeves's daycare created jobs for 4 other mothers and cared for 30 children, allowing their parents to work or continue education. The foundation became a model studied by philanthropic organizations nationwide. Hyperlocal charitable giving with minimal overhead and maximum impact. Red 1. Harvard Business School case study. Delegations from other communities visited to learn how it worked. But Margaret and Howard stayed unchanged. They still lived in their modest ranch house on Elm Street. Howard still drove the old Suburban with 200,000 miles on it. Margaret still shopped with coupons at the Safeway. Their trustee salary was comfortable but not extravagant. $80,000 a year combined. About what Howard had made during his best years in construction. "Why don't you buy a nicer house?" Jessica asked once. "You can afford it now." Margaret looked around their kitchen, at the old table where they'd raised 3 children, at the marks on the doorframe recording heights, at the view from the window she'd looked through for 42 years. "This is our home," she said simply. "Why would we need a different one?" The second anniversary of the vault's discovery arrived in November, marked by a celebration at the community center. Over 300 people attended, representing everyone the foundation had helped. Tom Johnson gave a speech about second chances. Sarah Chen spoke via video from MIT about the power of education. Patricia Reeves brought her daycare children, who sang a slightly off-key song they'd learned about helping neighbors. Margaret stood at the microphone, looking out over faces she'd known her whole life, and faces she'd met only through the foundation's work, and felt something settle in her chest. This was what Edmund's stolen fortune had become. Not buildings with brass plaques or investments earning more money, but changed lives, rebuilt hope, communities strengthened. "My uncle, Edmund Hartley, was a thief," she said, her voice steady. "He spent his career stealing from people who probably deserved to lose their money. But stealing is stealing. He hid that money for 25 years, unable to spend it or enjoy it because guilt ate at him like poison." She paused, looking at Howard, who smiled encouragingly. "When he died and left me his secret, I was terrified. I wanted to pretend I'd never found it. But my husband reminded me that truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is always better than lies. So we told the truth. We reported everything. And in doing so, we set in motion events that transformed stolen money into something that actually helps people." Edmund always claimed he was stealing from the rich to give to the poor. But he never did the giving part. He just hoarded it, trapped by his own guilt. Now, finally, his money is doing what he claimed he wanted it to do, not because he was brave enough to do it himself, but because circumstances and legal rulings forced it to happen. She smiled, tears in her eyes. "I don't know if that counts as redemption for him, but I know it's changed our lives and this community. And I know that every time we write a check that helps someone pay for surgery or go to college or save their business, we're taking something that was built on wrong and turning it into something right. Maybe that's the best any of us can hope for. To take the broken things we inherit and make them whole." The room erupted in applause. Margaret stepped down from the microphone, and Howard wrapped his arm around her, and they stood together while people lined up to shake their hands and share their stories. Late that night, after everyone had gone home and the community center was dark, Margaret and Howard drove up to the treehouse one last time. Emma had left the lights on, and the structure glowed in the darkness like a lantern in the forest. They climbed the spiral stairs and entered the main room. It looked different now. The bookshelves still lined the walls, but they held different books, donated volumes on psychology and healing, journals written by people who'd stayed there, poetry and art created during residencies. The fireplace still worked, but the hidden panel that had revealed the vault was gone, replaced by a large window that opened the space to the forest beyond. The vault itself was sealed with concrete, marked only by that simple plaque. All evidence of what had been hidden there was gone, except in memory and court records, and the money that continued to change lives. Margaret walked to the window and looked out at the moonlit forest. "Do you think he'd be pleased?" she asked. "Edmund, if he could see what his money became." Howard joined her, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "I think he'd be relieved. He carried that guilt for 25 years. Knowing it's finally doing good, yeah. I think he'd be pleased. I forgive him Margaret said softly, surprising herself. "I don't know if I have the right to, since I wasn't one of his victims, but I forgive him anyway. He was broken and complicated, and did terrible things, but he also created the means for tremendous good, even if he did it accidentally." They stood in silence for a long time, listening to the wind move through the pines, watching moonlight paint silver across the snow-dusted peaks in the distance. "We did it right," Howard finally said. "Every choice we made, every time we chose truth over comfort or honesty over profit, we did it right." "I know," Margaret said. "It wasn't easy. There were moments I wanted to lie, to hide, to keep the money, but we didn't. And look what came from that choice." She turned to face him. This man she'd spent 56 years loving, who'd stood beside her through the strangest, most challenging experience of their lives. "We're not rich, Howard. Not really. But we're the wealthiest people I know." He understood. She could see it in his eyes. They were wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with money. Wealthy in integrity maintained under pressure. Wealthy in love that had survived testing. Wealthy in the knowledge that they'd touched a fortune and let it go to serve something greater than themselves. They locked the treehouse and drove back down the mountain, back to their modest home in Pine Ridge, back to their ordinary life that had been made extraordinary. Not by wealth, but by the choices they'd made when wealth had come calling. The foundation continued its work. Years passed. Margaret turned 80, then Howard turned 82. They eventually stepped back from daily operations, letting Jessica and a new generation of leaders take over. But they remained on the board, attending meetings, reviewing applications, maintaining the vision that had guided them from the beginning. Help people, one at a time, without judgment or strings. The $69 million, carefully invested and thoughtfully distributed, had grown even as it was given away. The foundation's endowment actually increased over the years, ensuring it could continue operating indefinitely. Thousands of people had been helped. Hundreds of students had received education funding. Dozens of businesses had been started. Communities throughout the Colorado mountains had been revitalized. All of it traced back to one choice: to tell the truth when lying would have been easier. On a spring morning in her 85th year, Margaret sat on her porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the mountains. Her hands were more gnarled now, her movements slower, but her mind was clear and her heart was full. A car pulled up, and Sarah Chen stepped out. No longer the brilliant teenager they'd sent to MIT, but an accomplished woman in her 40s, now the principal of Pine Ridge High School. She carried a folder. "Mrs. Walsh," Sarah said, climbing the porch steps. "I wanted to show you something before we announce it publicly." She opened the folder and pulled out an architectural rendering. A new building, modern but respectful of its mountain setting, with large windows and open spaces. "The Sarah Hartley Educational Center," Sarah said, "funded by a grant from the Foundation's Education Endowment. It'll house expanded science labs, a makerspace, a library, and classrooms designed for 21st century learning. We break ground this summer." Margaret looked at the rendering, at this building that would bear the name of a woman who died over 40 years ago, whose love for a complicated man had indirectly led to all of this. "She would have loved this," Margaret said softly. "Not the building itself, but what it represents. Hope, second chances, the belief that people deserve investment." Sarah sat beside her. "You know, I tell my students about you every year, about the choice you and Mr. Walsh made. You could have kept quiet, tried to hide the money, lived like wealthy people. But you chose integrity instead. That's the most important lesson I can teach them, that who you are matters more than what you have. After Sarah left, Margaret sat for a long time, thinking about the journey that had begun with a cream-colored envelope and an inheritance she'd never wanted. She thought about Edmund, about the treehouse, about the vault and its staggering contents. She thought about the threats and the fear and the long legal battle. But mostly she thought about what had come after. The foundation, the transformed community, the thousands of lives touched by money that had been stolen but was now being used to heal and help and build. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of crushing doubt, of fear so intense she couldn't breathe, of temptation to just take the money and run. But she and Howard had chosen the harder path, the right path. And look what had grown from that choice. Not just a foundation or revitalized communities or educational centers, but proof that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, could choose to be extraordinary. That integrity mattered. That truth, even when costly, was worth the price. That wealth, real wealth, came not from what you kept, but from what you gave away. Margaret sipped her coffee and smiled, thinking about the girl she'd been at 73 before the letter arrived. That girl had thought her life was settled, her story written, her path clear until the end. She'd had no idea that the biggest adventure, the most important chapter, was still ahead. Sometimes the most valuable things we inherit aren't money or property or material goods. Sometimes they're challenges that force us to discover who we really are, tests that reveal our character, opportunities to prove that when everything is on the line, we're capable of choosing right over easy. Edmund had left her a fortune, but the real gift was the chance to prove to herself and the world that she was exactly who she'd always believed herself to be, a woman of integrity, compassion, and courage. And that, Margaret thought as the sun climbed higher and the morning warmed around her, was worth more than $215 million could ever be. Because anyone can inherit money, but building a legacy of genuine good, of lives changed and communities transformed, of choosing truth even when it costs everything. That took something money couldn't buy. A soul that refused to be corrupted, even when corruption would have been so very easy. Margaret finished her coffee, stood slowly, and went inside to make breakfast for Howard. They had foundation board meeting this afternoon, applications to review, people to help. Another day of giving away a fortune that had never really been theirs, transforming stolen money into honest hope. It was good work, the best work of her life. And it had all started with one simple choice: to tell the truth, no matter the cost. That choice had changed everything. Not just for her and Howard, but for thousands of people whose lives had been touched by the Sarah Hartley Foundation. And for future generations who would learn in buildings and benefit from programs funded by money that had been wrong until it was made right. Edmund's fortune had finally found its purpose. Not in offshore accounts or hidden vaults, but in scholarships and medical care, and small business loans and emergency assistance. In second chances and new beginnings and dreams made possible. And Margaret and Howard Walsh, two ordinary people from a small mountain town, had been the instruments of that transformation. Not because they were special or brilliant or powerful, but because when it mattered most, they'd chosen to be honest. Sometimes that's all it takes to change the world. Ordinary people making the choice to do extraordinary good when they could just as easily have chosen otherwise. That was their legacy. Not millions in the bank, but thousands of lives improved. Not buildings with their names on them, but a community transformed, Not wealth to pass to their children, but an example of integrity that would inspire generations. They'd inherited a secret that powerful people had killed to protect. They'd discovered a fortune that came with ghosts and guilt and danger. And they'd turned it all into something that Edmund Hartley had spent 25 years claiming he wanted, but never had the courage to create. Genuine, meaningful good. That was redemption. Not just for Edmund, but for the very idea that wrong things could be made right, that stolen wealth could become honest charity, that a curse could become a blessing, if the right people touched it with the right intentions. Margaret smiled as she cracked eggs into the pan. Howard would be up soon, and they had work to do. Good work. The work of turning a dead man's guilty fortune into living hope. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories that will move you. Click to keep exploring, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that integrity is the greatest fortune anyone can possess, and that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't money at all, but the chance to prove who you really are when everything is on the line.